Chapter 10, Part 8 of Guide to the Study of the Christian Religion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tony Richardson. Guide to the Study of the Christian Religion, edited by Gerald Birney Smith. Chapter 10, Part 8, Practical Theology. 8. The Psychology of Religion. 1. The relation of the psychology of religion to practical theology. Practical theology is concerned with the principles and methods by which religious life and work are developed, especially through the institution of the church. But religion is a human experience. It is a phase of human consciousness. Its principles and methods cannot be discussed without constant reference to psychological considerations. Our study of the sermon, evangelism, pastoral care, hymnology, and liturgies has again and again required reference to the psychology of religious experience. And the subject of religious education goes necessarily hand in hand with this science. In the university, the subject of the psychology of religion is naturally organized in the Department of Philosophy or of Psychology. In the divinity school, it may come to have an independent status, although there is not as yet any seminary with a chair so named. The intimate relation between the two fields of work has in more than one case put the psychology of religion with practical theology. Without laying undue emphasis upon this relation, a brief statement of the subject may be appropriate here. 2. The history of the science. This branch of study, strictly considered, is of very recent origin. Some articles in the American Journal of Psychology were early essays in this field. Such were Daniel's The New Life, A Study in Regeneration, 6, 1895, pages 61 through 103. Luba, Studies in the Psychology of Religious Phenomena, 7, 1896, pages 309 to 385. In 1899 appeared Starbuck's more comprehensive and elaborate work, The Psychology of Religion, New York, Scribner, 1899. This was mainly a study of the phenomena of conversion by means of the questionnaire. While it had of necessity the uncertainties involved in that method of investigation, it had an important part in awakening an interest in the possibilities of a critical study of religious experience. The following year appeared The Spiritual Life by Coe, New York, Revell, 1900. This book, though not based on numerous cases, discussed more critically and thoroughly the principles of conversion and of religious feeling, reaching conclusions very similar to those of Starbuck. In the same year in England, Granger published The Soul of the Christian, New York, Macmillan, 1900, a theoretical psychological study of conversion, visions and voices, love, ritual, prophecy, and theology. There followed in 1902 the really great and ingenious Gifford Lectures by William James on varieties of religious experience, New York, Longmans, Green and Company, 1902. Unlike his predecessors, James based his investigation on the biographies of many noted religious persons of the past, endeavoring from the standpoint of psychology to interpret those experiences that had been so often regarded as unique and inexplicable. James made much use of the theory of the subconscious, which has since been seriously questioned. In 1905, Davenport made a valuable contribution in Primitive Traits in Religious Revivals. New York, Macmillan, 1905. A keen study of those phenomena from the social as well as the psychological point of view. G. Stanley Hall, who had made wide investigations by the questionnaire method, founded in 1904 the Journal of Religious Psychology and Education, since 1912 the Journal of Religious Psychology, and has printed numerous essays in this field. The short-lived Zeitschrift für Religionspsychologie, published by Bristler and Halley, should also be noted. The work of Mérissier in France on the pathological phases of religious experience, of Delacroix and others on mysticism, of Flournoy on the psychology of inspiration, of Henry Bois on religious feeling, and Frommel on conversion made contributions to the science. Harold Bigby's practical observations of remarkable cases of conversion which he has given us in Twice Born Men, New York, Revell, 1909. Other Sheep, New York, George H. Doran and Company, 1912. Souls in Action, New York, George H. Doran and Company, 1911, etc., are important data for the psychologist. Pratt's Psychology of Religious Belief, New York, Macmillan, 1905, was an attempt to explain scientifically the belief attitude. Ames's Psychology of Religious Experience, Boston, Houghton Mifflin Company, 1910, is the best statement of the social theory of the development of religion, while Stratton has criticized this view in The Psychology of the Religious Life, London, Allen, 1911. In Germany, the work in the psychology of religion has not been clearly differentiated from that in the history of religion and in the psychology of religion. The number of workers in the field of psychology of religion is rapidly increasing, and in the last few years a large amount of material has appeared in the form of articles in scientific journals as well as in books. 3. Definition and scope. In distinction from metaphysics, the psychology of religion does not concern itself with the objective truth of religious beliefs. It has nothing to do with ontology. It is not concerned to establish the objective validity of any faith or rite, or even of religion itself. These considerations belong to theology proper, or to metaphysics. Religion, as we actually find it, is a part of human experience. Beliefs, feelings, activities of religion, just because they appear as states of consciousness, lend themselves to scientific observation, classification, and explanation. Pratt gives the following description of the task of the religious psychologist. Having recollected his facts, the psychologist will proceed as other scientists proceed with their data. That is to say, he will work his facts and note the general relations between them, thus seeking a systematic and general description of the various facts in the religious consciousness. Whenever possible, he will explain these facts by subsuming them under the laws of general psychology. That is to say, he will proceed on the assumption that, for the purposes of science, religious facts are not different in kind from other psychic facts. Thus he will seek to build up a scientific view of the religious life, interpreting and explaining it by itself and by the known facts and laws of the human mind. Irving King makes the important suggestion that in the psychology of religion, one must not take for granted the concepts of religionists and use them on the same level with psychological terms. Relation to the history of religion. Leuba distinguishes the psychology of religion from the history of religion on the ground that the former deals with the contents of consciousness, impulses, desires, representations, ideas, volitions, whereas the latter finds its data in the deeds of men and chiefly in the social resultants of the activities of individuals. The two, however, are very intimately related. Phylogenetic and ontogenetic problems. Many of the problems of the psychology of religion are anthropological, such as the origin of religion in the race, the rise of religious rites and ceremonies, the forms of beliefs, superstitions, etc., and even those that seem definitely individual, such as the rise of religious consciousness, the stages of religious development, the place of feeling, will, and ideas in religious consciousness, and such phenomena as conversion, sanctification, prayer, faith, revivals, worship, inspiration, prophecy, mysticism, all run back to anthropological considerations. While, however, this intimate relationship exists, the problems that are distinctly psychological are those which concern the religious consciousness as we know it. The Psychology of Religion, Journal of Religious Psychology, 5, page 386. 4. Methods. A consideration of the means by which the psychology of religion accumulates its facts is of prime importance, as upon this its validity depends. 4 methods may be distinguished as having been employed by investigators. The introspective method. This is the ordinary method in the science of mental life in general, which religious psychology may properly make use of. It may indeed be questioned whether a man to whom the religious experience is personally foreign, if such there be, is capable of making a proper estimate of the phenomena of religious consciousness. The best example of this method is Granger, The Soul of a Christian. The biographical method. This includes studies of biographies, autobiographies, letters, and other spontaneous expressions of religious persons. It has the value, of course, of widening the range of observation. James made use of this method in his Varieties of Religious Experience. The questionnaire method. This consists in collecting answers to definite questions from a large number of persons. Its value depends upon the skill with which the questions are framed with reference to securing the actual facts, the range of the investigation, the willingness and ability of the persons questioned to give adequate answers, and the skill of the investigator in the classification and interpretation of the answers. Its weakness is that the most suggestible persons usually answer the questions, that there is no means of checking the accuracy of the answers, and that very few persons are competent to give information regarding their own subjective life. An illustration of this method is Starbuck's Psychology of Religion. The comparative or objective method. The study of the relatively objective experiences of social religion furnished by history, anthropology, the sacred literature of various peoples, furnishes data of high scientific accuracy. This method is employed by Irving King in the development of religion and largely by Ames in his Psychology of Religious Experience. Other available methods. Besides the foregoing, which have commonly been employed, there are other possible methods of approaching the subject. The accurate and continued observation of a few individuals in their religious development should yield important results. The statistical method has to a certain extent been employed by all writers on the subject, but there is a large field before it in the study of the efficiency of the directed efforts toward religious development. How far the method of experimental psychology may be available is open to question. George E. Dawson has reported briefly an attempt in this direction in the Journal of Religious Psychology, Volume 2, 1913, pages 50 through 58. 5. Problems of psychology of religion. Definition of religion. The simple question, what is religion, is one of the most difficult and baffling to answer scientifically. The philosophy of religion has long been engaged upon a definition and has produced about 100 forms. Wright, in A Psychological Definition of Religion, American Journal of Theology, Volume 16, 1912, page 385, suggests that these are of three types. 1. Those having the general qualities of Hoffding's conservation of values. 2. Those insisting on the supernatural agency. 3. Those giving chief importance to the feeling element. Evidently, there is another distinction from the standpoint of the psychologist, namely whether religion arises as the product of social organization or has an instinctive basis in the nature of man. Ames and King represent the former point of view, James, Coe, and Stratton the latter. The religious experience of childhood. On the basis of genetic psychology, we are to ask, what is the nature of the religious in child consciousness? What is the criterion of religious sentiment in the child? What relation does it hold to other phases of child life? Different answers to these questions are suggested by the authors above cited. Those who conceive of religion as a social phenomenon consider that it belongs almost wholly to adolescence, childhood religion being objective, external, ritualistic, imitative. Those who find an indistinctive basis for religion in the individual would credit children with the possibility of a genuine, if simple, religious experience. Much further study of individual children needs to be made. The religious experience of youth. The most definite contribution that the psychology of religion has made is its recognition of the character of adolescent religion. The studies in Starbuck and Coe, and also those of G. Stanley Hall, have shown that conversion is really a natural phenomenon of adolescence based on the growing and expanding of the personal self. Its connection with the rise of the sex consciousness is very interesting, as is also its relation to the initiation ceremonies at puberty among primitive peoples. Some have gone so far as to consider religion itself as an outgrowth of sex feeling. The religious experience of the youth is so largely conditioned by adult preconception and prescriptions that there is still much opportunity for the study of its normal character. Conversion. Distinction ought to be made between the religious awakening of youth, which at its best is probably a process of evaluation and idealization, and that more vital crisis which James describes as the unifying of the divided self. The latter is generally the result of a long tension which finally yields to the relaxation of peace. Sex and religion. The question of the differences in the religious experiences of boys and girls, and of men and women, is a very interesting and important one. Most of the discussions on the subject rather superficially state that the female is subjective, introspective, sentimental, concerned with religion as a matter of personal feeling and with reference to future bliss, while the male is objective, rational, concerned with religion as a matter of conduct in this present world. It is said that our hymns and our churches are feminine, and that therefore women greatly outnumber men in them. Perhaps all this is more true of the past than of the present. and much of it may belong to the hereditary treatment which women have received rather than to their psychological constitution. At all events, it is becoming increasingly difficult to consider women in the categories thus laid down. They insist upon intellectualizing their religion and demanding outlets of religious activity, and they are prominent in reform and in philanthropy. Hall, Starbuck, Hazlitt, and Co. have attempted to make these sex distinctions in religious experience, but it is questionable whether we yet know very much about the matter. Most of the careful studies in adolescence have been made with boys. It is to be hoped that more will be done in the study of girls. Prayer. The psychology of religion has nothing to do with the objective efficacy of prayer, nor with the question of the reality of the being to whom prayer is addressed. This belongs to philosophy, not to psychology, and at last to faith, not to science. Psychologically, prayer is a resultant experience in attitude and in language of the awakened religious consciousness. It satisfies a psychological need. It has a definite subjective justification. The mental states of peace, exultation, and resolution which issue upon the exercise of prayer are due to the release of conscious tension. The demonstration of the Christian Scientist is, of course, psychologically of the same nature. Revivals. It is definitely recognized that there is a psychology of the crowd which is different from that of the individual. Such a book as Le Bon's The Crowd, London, Unwin, 1903, presents this fact with great clearness, though one is not obliged to accept his somewhat cynical view of democracy. The revival is a crowd phenomenon. Davenport's careful study of primitive traits in religious revivals, New York, Macmillan, 1905, indicates the essential character of these movements in that loss of normal inhibitions and that development of the sympathetic like-mindedness which explain many of the extraordinary results. So far from the feeling that these studies minimize the appreciation of the divine power in saving men, many earnest people think that they ought to enable us to understand the laws which are involved in such movements, so that we may conserve the good results and eliminate the dangers. On the basis of such conceptions, a healthy evangelism may well be developed. Worship. Feeling is predominant in primitive religion, and historically, worship developed as a means of securing effective results. The sacrifice, prayer, dance, feast, fasts, whatever may have been their supposedly objective value, derived their real significance from their manifestly subjective quality. The place of feeling in modern religion is an important question, and, in connection therewith, the part that symbolism and ritual ceremonies may play in stimulating it. While there are probably two types of mind, one type being aided by the introduction of outward symbols and ceremonies and the other hindered by it, it is equally true that no one is likely to be independent of the influence of concrete images and sense stimulations. One may be unaffected by the sacrament but powerfully stirred by religious music. Worship is significant to religion in four ways. 1. Consciousness is controlled and directed into religious paths. 2. There is a collective suggestibility. 3. The motor expressions of a feeling through ritual tend to a continuance of the emotion and may help toward making it of motor influence in conduct. And 4. The assumption of the bodily posture connected with any feeling tends to produce or to strengthen the feeling. This subject, together with the special significance of music, has been discussed in connection with the study of liturgies, inspiration, and prophecy. Faith believes in a revealing God. Psychology can only concern itself with the way in which the experience of that revelation appears in consciousness. The message which is received is usually a body of ideas suggested to the mind by the current state of affairs. It is, in other words, a subconscious inference from situations. It involves highly intellectual processes of judgment, imagination, and reasoning. Kaplan says, revelation is a sudden mysterious awareness of an inflow of thought, an inundation of spirit, an awakening of mind, seemingly from unaccountable subconscious sources, and therefore believed to be through supernatural agency. The prophet really delivered a rational message, although it may often have seemed to him to be other than his own. The vitally important matter for modern religion is that the rational character of the message shall be understood so that the modern recipient may realize his own responsibility of rational interpretation. An objective message from deity must be obeyed without thought or question. The inspired message through a man must be evaluated in human experience. So may the psychology of religion help our faith. Mysticism. Mysticism, as an experience subject to psychological investigation, is a consciousness of immediate union with the infinite. The emotional element always predominates, and the fundamental quality of the emotionalism is love. Mystic experiences are of many kinds and are much dependent upon individual temperament. The absorption of the mind in one dominant idea and the excess of undifferentiated emotion which generally accompanies it may easily result in abnormality and mental disease. Yet all forms of religious experience contain some element of mysticism, and all the great saints have been mystics. In the practical religion that is so much desiderated by many for modern times, it is of great moment to inquire what place will be found for the mystic element that has characterized the supreme religious spirits of the past. Ethnic aspects of religious consciousness. The history of religion is concerned with the comparative study of the objective facts. The psychology of religion may undertake to discover the actual differences in the religious experience of persons of different races. Does the Japanese youth have an evaluated experience with reference to the sun god that is comparable with the religious awakening of the Christian youth? If not, does the difference lie in the intellectual content of the religion or in any ethnic quality of mind? Evidently, if missionary education is to be carried on scientifically, much remains to be done in this field. Conclusion. The foregoing are some of the more important problems which it is the task of the developing science of the psychology of religion to investigate. There are many others, for every phase of religion has its psychological aspect. As above indicated, the employment of the results of these studies in practical religious work is the task of religious education. End of chapter 10, part 8.
Chapter 11, Part 1, of Guide to the Study of the Christian Religion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Guide to the Study of the Christian Religion, edited by Gerald Birney Smith. Chapter 11, Part 1, Christianity and Social Problems. The social evolution of Christianity. The development of the Hebrew religion. The Old Testament supplies materials for a history of the growth of the Hebrew people, its evolution from tribal conditions to its incorporation into the Roman Empire. These fragmentary documents are themselves composed of varied notices of the land, population, industries, domestic experiences, trade, art, customs, sentiments, laws, governments, wars, and treaties of Palestine and neighboring countries. They reflect the state of knowledge, the superstitions, the changing policies, the ceremonies, philosophies, and beliefs of the people at different periods. The ideas of God which came into expression are affected by all these experiences of persons of many degrees of ethical and spiritual ripeness. The later editors of the books sought to reduce the apparent inconsistencies more or less consciously, but many anomalies remain, fortunately for a better understanding of the real course of progress. Specialists in Hebrew literature and history must be consulted for the details. For our present purpose it must suffice to indicate a few results of the process. The conception of God which emerged out of the long struggle is central, the idea of the one almighty creator of heaven and earth, righteous himself and requiring righteousness in heart and conduct of all men, caring little for ceremonies, everything for justice, mercy, and humble piety, and demanding obedience to holy law in all relations of life, domestic, commercial, political. The narrow popular conceptions, the fiercely patriotic narrowness of certain parties, the materialistic and catastrophic expectations of the Messiah as avenger and restorer of Israel, modify and pollute these lofty conceptions, but do not altogether obliterate them. Here and there, visions of international moral and religious comity, and even of immortality, widen the horizon of thought. The message of Jesus. Jesus brought to consciousness the infinite worth of personality in communion with God the Father. Compared with the blessedness of fellowship with God, all other interests seemed to him secondary, and might be postponed. The essentials are in the Beatitudes: mercy, peace, humility, purity of heart. Jesus was not ascetic, not indifferent to the hunger, the pain, and the joy of this life, but he insisted on the supreme and all-inclusive good, whatever else deserved consideration. He did not attempt to make laws, nor to organize a church or government. He promulgated no social program. Yet when his views of God, of friendship, of holiness, of virtue, of the boundless worth of a person are accepted, the seeds of social revolution and progress are planted. The primitive church. The early followers of Jesus huddled together for mutual protection, dreading the coming storm of persecution, and attracted also by the enthusiasm of devotion to the ascended Lord. They apparently misapprehended Jesus' words about a swiftly coming kingdom, and even pulled wires to make sure of prominent offices. They believed that the world without was soon to fall with a crash. Crowns and thrones, merchandise and art, far-seeing plans of improvement, were out of the question, too unimportant for them to consider. Most of the early Christians were of the petty trading class, if not wretched slaves. Few distinguished men of state or learning at first deigned to notice them. They lived in small circles of intimates. Their philanthropy was expressed in almsgiving, with a few simple rules to prevent abuses. It was not worth while to try to save the institutions of society, or to try to mend them. All would soon be consumed, and a new earth emerge out of the flames. We look in vain for any large constructive policy under such conditions. Yet the ferment of divine friendship was there, and the little congregation became the nurseries of sentiments which one day would dominate the policies of nations. Time passed. Knowledge enlarged with experience. The heavens did not depart as a scroll. The churches were welded together by the bishops into organized institutions. The authorities of the empire were compelled to pay attention to the new society, even when they persecuted it. Constantine and the Latin Church. The reign of Constantine marks a new epoch, the recognition of the Church by the government. The beginning of ecclesiastical influence and gradually grew naturally out of the ancient system. When the center of sovereignty was transferred to Constantinople, the bishop of the Eternal City stood alone in Italy as the representative of this ideal, and men of genius were ready to take advantage of the opportunity for the greater glory of God. As the legions turned from the north defeated, missionaries, by martyrdom, charity, learning, pomp, and mystery, carried the ancient culture to the Teutons, and Charlemagne tried to learn to write Latin and to establish a sort of university at his court. But native Teutonic culture was never extinguished. It entered with new factors into the movement of civilization, developed the free spirit of cities and gradually a nation, kept on its own course in civil and criminal law, with Roman grafts on its rude, strong trunk of custom, created its own literature, finally broke with Roman control into the humanist and Reformation movements, and aspired to supreme influence in the science and trade of mankind. Medieval thought. In this long and complicated process, the doctrines, the feelings, the ideals, the institutions which were called Christianity were all modified. The Bible was quoted by all parties, but by none with the exact primitive meaning. Both Plato and Aristotle profoundly influenced the theologians, as is seen in Aquinas and Dante. They contributed political, economic, ethical, and even religious ideas too valuable to be lost. The Church, from its origin down, had leaders of sufficient learning and ability to discover and appreciate these classical elements, and to utilize them. They justified themselves for this borrowing process on various grounds, but the significant fact is that they borrowed without stint or scruple, and our Christianity is immensely richer for their studies. The Renaissance. When, with the Renaissance, the Greek literature was brought to Italy, the ecclesiastics went mad over profane and even unclean classics. The storm broke out again, and when it cleared, the classics at times almost displaced the Bible in Europe and America as the substantial material of academic culture. The assimilation of the ancient ideas is so complete that we read them into the simplest parables of Jesus and into the rabbinical metaphysics of Paul, often to the concealment of their real meaning. The critical operation of dissecting out the originals of our stocks of ethical and theological conceptions is not yet complete. Since all that is true emanates from the one Holy Spirit who dwelt in Jesus, we may enjoy our full heritage without anxiety about the human sources. All things are Christ's. Christ is God's. The Reformation. The Reformers helped to liberate human spirits from bondage to ecclesiastical absolutism, and to seek a direct and personal communion with God by a living faith. In matters pertaining to church and state, the Lutherans and the Calvinists parted company, the latter making a larger contribution to the activity of the church in the affairs of daily life. Neither entirely escaped from the delusion that religious orthodoxy can be enforced by political power. Neither quite attained confidence in the self-evidencing truth of religion as a personal experience. Instead of relying on a pope, they leaned on a book for a prop of infallibility. But devout men, whether Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist, or sectarian, all possessed within themselves a life which proceeded immediately from God, and was not at the mercy of changes of creed or church. The assimilating power of Christianity. One of the distinctive features of Christianity is its power of assimilation without loss of its genius. Hinduism appropriates and swallows up in the gulf of nihilism all sorts of faiths. Christianity assimilates novel and diverse elements from Palestine, Greece, Rome, and the Far Orient, yet without failing to assert uncompromisingly the holiness of the supreme God, the redemption which sinful men need, and the hope of personal immortality which gives value to time. Christianity as a contemporary system of beliefs, life, institutions. To the historical student, contemporary Christianity reveals many elements, some of them contradictory, which have come down to us from many sources. It would be easy to show that the doctrines of the churches of today are not in a single instance precisely those of the early Christians, that the various ceremonies and modes of administration which characterize multiplied sects could not all be those of the apostolic church. If we attempted literally to go back to Jesus in the sense of believing and teaching what can be found in his words, we should be poorer than we are. For evil and for good, every age, experience, system, debate, and organization of the past has left its precipitate in our institutions, convictions, customs, and modes of thinking. The problem is not to find and keep what was known to the primitive churches, but what is true, valuable, workable now. No one who really believes in Christ can ever fear that a new truth will contradict his fundamental ideals. No one who intelligently repeats the creed, "I believe in the Holy Ghost," can fear to trust him who is guide into all truth. No one should pretend, by legerdemain and juggling with words, to deduce his social science from biblical texts. He will do well to live in spiritual contact with lawgivers and prophets, with the apostles, and with Jesus most of all. But he wrongs these by asking them to describe, explain, and interpret the phenomena of all lands, peoples, and ages so as to make investigation superfluous and to give countenance to intellectual indolence. Religion is life in the realm of values, above the causal series whose unbroken iron chain belongs to the domain of the sciences, including history and all social sciences. There is sharp conflict the moment the seer assumes the role of statistician and statesman. Nothing is more pitiful than the solemn tricks some devout biblical students have played with the cryptic symbols of Daniel and the dream of Patmos, and the equally mistaken attempt to evolve from a spiritual maxim of Jesus a legal constitution for family, republic, or industrial system. Biblical exegesis cannot be substituted for social science. It is only fair to call attention to the fact that the conclusion here stated is entirely opposed to the position of many excellent writers who think that we can find in the words of Jesus an answer to all the social questions of our age. The revelation of God in the Bible was never intended to be a substitute for common sense, invention, and investigation according to the requirements of changing situations. The proof of this statement is found first of all in the utter failure of merely exegetical studies to throw light on any modern problem, save by furnishing fundamental ideals and religious inspiration. The businessman who selected his investments by reference to scripture texts would soon go bankrupt. The Canadian farmer who treated the descriptions of Palestinian agriculture in the Psalms as authority for his plowing and planting would perish with his children on the fertile prairie of the Northwest. The statesman who consulted the Pentateuch or the parables of the New Testament for direction in drawing up statutes of social legislation would never be returned to the legislature. He would probably be sent to a hospital for the mentally disturbed. The disappointments which have befallen those who have tried to foretell events by interpreting the apocalypse are familiar to all students of church history. Principles of righteousness in morals and religion are Christian, even though they cannot be explicitly and verbally drawn from Old or New Testament. Finding a teaching good is a discovery of a revelation of the will of the Father, no matter how new. Unless Christ is dead, as his enemies claim, he is doing something now. He is not threshing out dry chaff, nor moving in a circle like a blind animal turning a wheel. He is the everlasting Creator. It is his Spirit which is guiding into new truth, and some day we shall realize that this is the final and only adequate explanation of those great and growing creations which we call science, art, and progress. End of Chapter 11, Part 1. Chapter 11, Part 2, of Guide to the Study of the Christian Religion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Guide to the Study of the Christian Religion, edited by Gerald Birney Smith. Chapter 11, Part 2. Contemporary Social Problems. Fundamental Scientific Discipline. The equipment essential to social leadership. There is no easy substitute for scientific toil. The traditional and conventional equipment of the college and theological seminary of the past has left men helpless in the presence of new situations in which Christian laymen find themselves in consequence of the industrial revolution of the last century and the problems it has brought. It may possibly be an open question with some preachers whether they should ever try to help the men of their congregations find the path of righteousness in this babel and labyrinth of conflicting interests. Perhaps many saintly men, while remaining quite innocent of the knowledge of the actual world, may inspire and comfort, and may have the gift of soothing with rhetorical and poetic charms. There is a literature of power and beauty which belongs to all times, because it has a universal value, and it is by no means to be underrated in these materialistic and mammon-serving times. Certainly no preacher who has missed the opportunity to study social science should pretend to instruct others when he is incompetent himself. There are others, however, who believe themselves called to give strong intellectual help to honest Christian men seeking to do justice in a new world where all ancient experience is inadequate, and to proclaim a judgment to come against the contemporary and impenitent workers of iniquity. Ministers of this type are also needed, and they should at least be tolerated by the orthodox. In a period of intellectual pitilessness and readjustment, there is a good need of charitable judgment on both sides. It may prove to be necessary for the Church to provide for specialization in the ministry, for the Spirit grants a diversity of gifts. The artistic preacher has his function and his following, but he is likely to jumble statistics. The scientific temperament inclines to severe and exact reasoning on the basis of precise measurement of facts, and there are congregations which enjoy and profit by the kind of sermons which grow naturally out of such a method. In the good time coming, when union churches will displace sectarian chapels, it may not be difficult to establish a new and modern itinerant system, lest one good custom should corrupt the world. In a well-trained orchestra, the violin does not say to the violoncello, "I have no need of thee." In a truly Catholic church, we ought to find devout mystics who dwell much alone and apart in protracted meditation, and who are able to make the invisible seem real. Let them dream their dreams, but not meddle with strikes. The musician who tries to make steel rails imperils his fellow workmen and loses the cunning of his delicate fingers. The knowledge which is required for this novel situation is that contained in the modern sciences on which our industrial technique, our administration of business and government is based. Preparation for understanding the ethical difficulties and obligations of the modern man demands a study not only of the essential ideas of the civilizations of Greece, Rome, Palestine, and the Hanseatic cities, but of physics, chemistry, physiography, biology, preventive medicine, economics, politics, and sociology. A profound blunder has been committed by men who have been eager to master in a fortnight all the social problems, while they were still without training in social science. This is a rank quackery, and brings the speaker or writer into contempt, and it injures church and religion. The general social sciences, as economics, political science, jurisprudence, sociology, with statistics as a method of research which belongs to all, have for their first purpose a description of the phenomena of contemporary human association, and their explanation in terms of antecedents and causes. The special or practical social sciences have for their function the study of the improvement of methods of promoting human welfare by concerted volition, guided by knowledge and urged by motives. The historical evolution of social ideals and institutions. Evolution of the race and its institutions. The popular conception which we have inherited from traditional theology is that of a series of disconnected, unrelated events nailed together by some constant supernatural, magical, unintelligible intervention. The modern scientific conception is that of an immanent, organic force working steadily and perpetually without a break and without interference, the idea of evolution. Theism has been held to by partisans of both views, but the modern scholar, whether theist or agnostic, habitually thinks in terms of evolution. The religious leader, who has followed only the traditional theological curriculum, cannot understand the modern man of scientific training, and cannot himself be understood by modern men. They live in different worlds of thought. They speak a different language. If a spiritual guide really desires to become intelligible to the men of our age, he cannot do better than to put himself through as thorough a course of study as possible in the fundamental principles of biology, psychology, the evolution of animals and man, early cultural history, anthropology, the evolution of morals and religion. The importance of historical knowledge. There is another scientific discipline which is necessary to attain a sane view of contemporary problems, the study of history, the history of institutions, and the history of reflective thought about institutions and experiences. Thus, there is a history of industry and commerce, of political organization and law, of art and literature, of domestic life, of religion and ecclesiastical forms. There is also a history of the theories of economics, politics, ethics, dogma, and ceremonies of science, inventions, arts. The great advantage of the evolutionary conception is that it tends to produce a chastened hopefulness, prepares the mind for inevitable changes, and curbs immoderate haste and mob fury. Short views of social conditions paralyze effort, because the mind has no help from a survey of the long road upward which humanity has already traveled, and of the achievements of the human intellect and will, in spite of innumerable blunders and crimes. On the other hand, a study of evolution steadies the mind and checks animal and savage impulse by revealing the power of habit and custom, the inertia of institutions once established, the necessity of making new adjustments, both external and internal, before a new system can be made to work. Take, for example, the questions which just now are so difficult to discuss with philosophic calm and clear vision, those relating to the control of industry and commerce. The passion which formerly made the discussion of theology and politics so spectacular has died down. The partisan instincts of mobs now concentrate upon the mastery of the instruments of production, land, machines, railways, telegraphs, banks. Never was self-possession and freedom from prejudice so necessary to avert a shipwreck. Never was it so difficult as now to be just to antagonists. The evolutionary concept may become general enough to help us past the rocks and shoals which now seem so ominous. The conservatives who now control society's capital and direct it are partly right in declaring that their services are useful and necessary, that the people have not yet developed that degree of intelligence, morality, loyalty, and skill in government which is necessary for the management of great industries through elected representatives on salary. But the conservatives often err in supposing that the capitalist manager system is ancient and eternal, for it is neither. It is recent in origin, is being rapidly transformed, is even now competing with both hand industries and public industries, and utopians see signs of its gradually going into the hands of receivers. A genuinely evolutionary view would modify much of the dogmatism which is far too prevalent in industrial disputes. The main aspects of the development of industry and commerce. It is impossible to interpret the religious life and thought of the Hebrew people and primitive Christians without a careful study of the stages of development. So it is equally impossible to understand the capitalist manager system of our age without keeping before our minds the antecedent forms of industry out of which our system has grown. The studies of Schmoller, Grundriss der allgemeinen Volkswirtschaftslehre, Leipzig, Duncker and Humboldt, 1900 to 1904. Bücher, Die Entstehung der Volkswirtschaft, 8th edition, Tübingen, Laup, 1910. Sombat, for example, Der moderne Kapitalismus, Leipzig, Duncker and Humboldt, 1902, English translation, The Quintessence of Capital, New York, E.P. Dutton and Company, 1915, and Sozialismus und soziale Bewegung im 19. Jahrhundert, Jena, Fischer, 1896, English translation, Socialism and the Social Movement, New York, Putnam, 1898. And other recent economists enable us to present this evolution in its essential features with a high degree of certainty and clearness. Thinking chiefly of European and American history, we are able to discover the following stages. A. Primitive industrial conditions. First on the horizon of our knowledge are the pastoral group settling down to agriculture, each man cultivating the soil and producing only what his own household requires, with no excess product for the market. The individual householder belongs to a village community and later passes under the protection and control of a feudal landlord. Princes, bishops, and knights have large domains, but also live on what their estates, with contributions from vassals, can produce. All live near the edge of starvation, and in times of scarcity the mortality from famine and disease is high. Capital is small. The villagers are exposed to the exactions of nobles, with some protection from the village organization, and the struggles of classes begin in the resistance of peasants to exploitation by their social superiors. B. Medieval industry and trade. During the early medieval period, the rise of towns and cities offers a new starting point of industrial, political, and moral development. With improved methods of agriculture and stock breeding, with better roads and boats, the surplus product of the fields finds a local market in towns in exchange for the manufactured commodities made by the craftsmen. Only in articles of luxury, such as spices and jewels, is there trade with distant regions. Bulky articles cannot be transported far. Producers and consumers are personal acquaintances, and each man has his customers. Slowly, a few men of higher ability and enterprise accumulate capital, undertake larger contracts, employ money in exchange instead of barter. Population becomes more dense, division of labor is necessary, social classes are differentiated, conflicts arise over division of profits, use of markets, taxes and tributes, guild regulations. C. The downfall of feudalism. From the 15th to the 18th century, the middle-sized states and the modern great nations emerge under the royal houses, as in Germany, France, Spain, England. The feudal lords and the church are held responsible to kings. The supremacy of the papacy is weakened and falls. Capital funds are enlarged, and the concentration of wealth and trade in a few hands becomes more frequent and manifest. New trades arise to meet new wants. The Reformation transforms the political and spiritual direction of society. D. Modern industrial conditions. With the colonial policies following the discovery of sea routes to India and America, trade becomes worldwide. The village market widens into an intercontinental market. The vast new enterprises require great capital, larger numbers of workmen under one management, joint stock corporations with limited liability, division of labor, increased use of machinery. The invention of the steam engine still further calls for more compact population, larger masses of capital, more stringent regulation and discipline of labor. The industrial commander, whose energy and ability, rather than refinement and humanity, give him first place, becomes ascendant, while priests, scholars, and feudal nobility retreat into the background. The last word of the 18th century is freedom and individualism, and with free trade and free competition, the businessman becomes a prince, capital becomes colossal, trade unions are fought to their death, legal protection is opposed tooth and claw, and monstrous cruelties, with the degradation of working people, at last shock and alarm the nations and awaken a social conscience. The reaction sets in about 1860, with an assertion of the moral duty of the state to all its citizens. Over against the huge corporations with their vast financial and political dominion rise the national federations of labor, the extension of the suffrage, the increased political power of the wage earners, and the international organization of socialism. We now live in the midst of a transformation more significant than the fall of the Roman Empire, the rise of modern nationalities, or the Reformation. We cannot yet see clearly for the smoke of the battle, our nearness to the contestants, and our personal participation in the passions of the conflict. The Church and modern industrialism. The Church itself, once mistress of empires, is stripped of all authority and is reduced to a voluntary association protected by the state. Its claim to infallibility is disowned. The problem is altogether new, and the revolution finds ecclesiastical leaders confused and unprepared. They go out with ancient bows and arrows to resist rapid-firing field pieces and titanic cannon. Their medieval commands are mocked alike by masters and men. The movement sweeps along as if the clergy did not exist. The echoes of ancient creeds sound hollow and faint in the roar of the contemporary struggle of interests. And yet the Church carries in its traditions and its heart the only principle which can assure the future of mankind, if only its prophets learn in time how to interpret and apply it to the problems of our own age. The need of historical perspective. There are radicals who still think in terms of magic and miracle, and who make their dupes believe that by some universal strike or other direct action the world will be made over in a few hours. They are like a band of Chinese pirates who stole a complicated and costly electric machine from a railway station in Kwangtung province, and then did not know how to make it function. If the IWW could by some cataclysm take possession tomorrow of all the mines, mills, and railways of the country, would they be able to use them to advantage, or at all? Those whose mode of thought is evolutionary are convinced that democracy has come to stay, but that it has much to learn. That boys cannot do the work of men, nor crowds of turbulent Reds, trained to destroy machinery, be long trusted with its direction. It is true, the alternative is sometimes provoking, paying a few Napoleons of finance fabulous sums for their as yet indispensable services, while submitting to their taunts that it is all their own private business, into which the public has no concern or right to intrude. The only possible mode of avoiding tragic conflict under these conditions of passion and prejudice, arrayed against passion and prejudice, is to cultivate the historic sense. The evolution of ideas and ideals. Not only industry and commerce, but all other activities of mankind are in this life-current of evolution, and should be studied in the same spirit. There is a measure of truth in the economic interpretation of history, which finds in the modifications of the industrial organization the clue to changes in art, science, morals, religion, philosophy. But this interpretation is inadequate. Physical changes do affect thinking, but constant experience and common sense reveal the other side of reality. We men modify things by thinking and by action. The capitalistic system is a mode of belief, and if socialism ever dominates the world, it will be because men have thought upon it, imagined it, resolved to have it, and voted it. It is amusing to see the immense energy of the leaders of the materialistic school who teach fatalism and practice idealism with all their might. We must be content in this scant sketch barely to indicate various aspects of the evolution of man's spiritual life which are so amply and ably treated in competent works on the history of the evolution of the sciences, of the technical inventions and processes, of the fine arts, of ethics, of religion, of theology, and of philosophy. The domestic, educational, political, and professional institutions have passed through various stages, and each change in all departments of thought or action has set up profound changes in all directions. We have already touched upon the evolution of Christianity itself, of its ideas, teachings, organization, administration in the Church. This course of development ran parallel with that of art, politics, science, industry, law, and there has been constant interaction and reciprocal influence among all the movements of the human spirit. Culture history ought not to be conceived as an evolution outside the will of humanity, but as the very deed of humanity. Events do not happen, they are made, and made by the human will. Evolution of poor relief. Christianity is essentially charity in the deepest, finest, and most real meaning. The first organization of the churches provided for relief of the distressed, widows, and orphans, and this function of the churches has never been abandoned, though it has often been perverted. In the simple life of the small primitive congregations, the faithful brought their offerings of money or commodities and laid them before the bishops for distribution, and both men and women were appointed to assist the elders in the administration. The officers became more numerous and specialized with the growth of the church. In Greece and Italy, the churches took on the form of associations which were protected by law, and which, in addition to regular membership fees, had an established custom of offering gifts for the poor in connection with worship. To the love feasts the indigent were invited, and there satisfied their hunger. With the cessation of heathen persecutions, the recognition of Christianity as the state religion, the increase of war and poverty, the acquisition of estates and enormous incomes, the principles and methods of relief changed. Almsgiving was often impulsive and without method, and the largesses of bishops often encouraged mendicancy without preventing suffering. The causes of misery were too deep and powerful to be cured with doles, and the Church had no policy of prevention. The belief in the merit of almsgiving without regard to its effects on the poor became popular. Hospices, hospitals, monasteries, and orders gradually took the place of the congregational and personal relief system of the early Church. The road to the church door was the resort of beggars. Ignorance of medical science made the devotion of merciful Christians impotent to stay the pestilence, heal the leper, and restore reason to the insane. The history of medieval charity is a tragedy of errors, a record of superstition, but also a sublime revelation of consecration and mercy struggling in the dark. With the rise of commerce and free cities in the 12th century, and later the merchant class, rose in influence and gradually transferred the direction of relief from the clergy to the laity, this tendency being more marked in northern Europe. The Lutheran Reformation did not improve methods of relief. Wars and theological controversies paralyzed the hopeful beginning in the 16th century. The Calvinistic churches developed ecclesiastical and civil relief, while England, in 1601, established the first poor law, on the principle that the entire Christian nation ought to combine for the relief of its weakest member, and this principle is shaping the policies of all modern nations. The humanism of the 16th century and the illumination of the 18th century went beyond Lutheranism and Calvinism in demanding that religion should carry the torch of science to light the dark ways of struggling humanity. In modern times, that regard for the lowly which once was limited to feeble little conventicles has become the accepted obligation of all the mightiest governments of the earth. The charity of churches and of voluntary associations is still precious and necessary, but in the main auxiliary to the institutions of the Commonwealth. The development of modern social political ideals. Gradually, since the Reformation, social politics has been differentiated from poor relief. Friendship and justice now aim rather to prevent misery than to palliate it, and to make men self-supporting rather than to cultivate helpless, whining parasites and beggars. Christianity, though it did not absolutely create something out of nothing, published and developed in the world finer and higher notions of the value of personality, the dignity of sonship in God, the reality of brotherhood in the human race. Local sympathy gained a cosmopolitan character. The physical world and the glory of empire would vanish in flame and earthquake, but God and the soul were imperishable. Such ideas as these, with a gospel of redemption and hope, took captive the rude but vigorous and conquering barbarians. Augustine gathered up in a great system of theology the ideas of Christianity, Neoplatonism, Origen, and Plotinus, and provided a philosophy for the Church. Arabian physicians of the Middle Ages became acquainted with the natural science of Aristotle and other Greek philosophers. The contacts of the Crusades and travels of Jewish merchants brought this learning to the scholars of Europe, and helped the tendency to study nature directly and not merely by tradition. And now, Church and State seem to be seeking a way not of suppressing each other, but of serving, through diverse methods, the welfare of mankind in the partnership of unifying ideals and scientific procedure. End of Chapter 11, Part 2.
Chapter 11, Part 3 of Guide to the Study of the Christian Religion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Danny Hogger. Guide to the Study of the Christian Religion, edited by Gerald Birney Smith. Chapter 11, Part 3. Personal Preparation for Leadership and Social Service. Education in the Social Sciences. In the high school, if the studies of childhood and youth could be directed with reference to large and effective cooperation for service of the community, they would certainly include some acquaintance with the French and German languages, in addition to English as necessary tools of knowledge and vehicles of communication. The usual elementary subjects should include a great deal of nature study and familiarity with the pictured life of primitive peoples. In the secondary school, it is not too much to ask for an introduction in biology and the elements of personal, domestic, and industrial hygiene, the history of the United States and its political institutions, and the service rendered by the local and general governments. Books and articles in German and French should be read on these subjects, and interesting knowledge should be obtained by young persons through the languages. The well-trained teachers will be able to apply mathematics to simple statistical surveys of the neighborhood. Friendly activities, guided by experts, will keep alive social sympathies, and provision for practical expression of ethical convictions and emotion should be made in high school and church school for adolescents. The Bible should be studied as the record of a life process and as a stimulus to altruistic endeavor. In the college and university, in college the candidate for the ministry and for religious service should be kept in constant contact with social movements, both in his studies and in his activities. The development of character depends quite as much on habits of unselfish service as on the precepts of morality, the exhortations of the preacher, and habits of worship. Nothing is said here of mathematics and literature, the high value of which is assumed. The students which prepare most directly for social leadership are physiography, geography, history, statistics as a necessary tool of all sciences, a survey of the whole field of the social sciences, biology, psychology, economics, political science, general sociology, ethics, history of philosophy, logic, and a study of selected problems of social amelioration accompanied by wisely supervised participation in some forms of service. Such a course would establish habits of keen observation, induction, discovery of causes, forming of judgments, interest in general welfare. In the senior year of college and during the years of graduate study, the candidate for social leadership in the church should take up more specialized subjects. Church history, biblical study, pastoral duties, and religious education may be closely correlated with social science. In the study of theology and the Bible, the social motive and ideals will be made clear and potent. In the study of church history, the evolution of Christian life in relation to law, government, poor relief, social politics, slavery, domestic conduct, customs, education, etc., ought to find a large place, while time could be saved by passing over the study of dead controversies about creed and ceremonies. The problems of social surveys, statistical investigations, the amelioration of conditions in cities and rural neighborhoods, the care of immigrants, and social service in foreign fields should find a place. On the basis of previous studies of elementary economics, politics, the law of the fields of social politics, labor legislation, trade unionism, and socialism should receive attention. The most vital principles of poor relief and of the social treatment of the antisocial class should be familiar. Curriculum of Past Sciences. We here present a curriculum drawn up by Professor L.C. Marshall, with a schematic diagram of some of the courses actually offered and taught in several universities of large equipment. Many of the fundamental courses are given in well-equipped colleges or even in secondary schools. The accompanying diagram serves to outline in a broad way the organization of studies in preparation for philanthropic service. The first aim, see diagram, is to secure for the student a broad cultural foundation in the main divisions of human knowledge. Above this foundation is placed a broad survey of the social sciences. In these social science survey courses, the future businessman, the future social worker, the future civil servant, and the future teacher and investigator in the various social science departments will be led to appreciate the relationships of their future specialized tasks to the operations of the rest of organized society. Even after the social science survey has been completed, narrow specialization may not occur. The work of the third year consists of basic semi-cultural, semi-professional courses designed to give the student a clearer appreciation of the organization of modern society than was possible in the social science survey. The academic spirit, using this expression in the objectionable sense, by introducing a considerable amount of contact with actual conditions, by lectures on technical matters by outside experts, by instruction through the case method as far as it is at present possible, and by requiring that the equivalent of at least 3 months shall be spent in actual service. The final stage is the distinctly professional work, partly of undergraduate, partly of graduate grade, in which the student cultivates intensively his own special field. The student who has traversed these stages should go out with some idea of social needs, with some zeal of serving those needs, with some appreciation of the rights, the privileges, and the obligations of other members of society, and with which training should enable him to do his work efficiently. In the administration of the work of the School of Commerce and Administration of the University of Chicago, the following features are significant. 1. The work is organized on the hypothesis that the technical or professional work should rest upon a broad foundation of work in biology, psychology, history, political economy, sociology, law, and government. Full preparation accordingly contemplates at least 1 year of graduate work over and above a properly selected undergraduate curriculum. 2. There is no general or machine curriculum in either the undergraduate or the graduate work in the school. Each student's course is a matter of personal adjustment and depends upon previous training, present aptitudes, and expected future occupation. 3. The equivalent of at least 3 months of field work must either precede or accompany the technical or professional work. At first sight, this scheme of courses seems to bewilder and discourage. More careful study and inquiry of competent instructors will make it clear that there is a progressive movement from the elementary and broadly fundamental studies to those which are special and professional, intended for advanced students who seek to fit themselves with some form of public service. The young student cannot make a wise selection without personal advice. The courses chosen should be carefully arranged in a series for each student, so that he will become a master of some branches while gaining a broad general view of the relationships of sciences and of life callings and relationships. Without very careful planning in advance, the young person may scatter his efforts, become an intellectual vagabond, and end by knowing no one subject thoroughly. All these academic studies should be driven home by visits of observation, carefully planned to discover methods of constructive work rather than the abnormal and pathological aspects of vice. Observation must be extended by actual practice in connection with well-organized societies for philanthropy and civic improvement, under trained and practical administrators. Teamwork among professors in the theological school would be promoted by keeping in the central office of the dean or president rather full syllabi of courses given, so as to economize the teaching force, avoid duplication, and discover neglected areas. The indications of a modern curriculum of social science given above will show how various specialists can best cooperate, and that without losing anything of independence or thought or method of investigation. End of Section 3. Recording by Danny Hogger, Fullerton, California. www.dannyhogger.com. Chapter 11, Part 4, of Guide to the Study of the Christian Religion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Danny Hogger. Guide to the Study of the Christian Religion, edited by Gerald Birney Smith. Chapter 11, Part 4, Analysis and Classification of Social Problems. Every thinker must classify social problems, because they are too numerous and bewildering for orderly discussion until they are grouped. But every thinker is likely to make his own arrangement. We may deal with this subject by means of two categories. 1. The social groups, and 2. The community interests. 1. The social groups. They are provisionally distinguished as follows: the family, the rural neighborhood, the urban community, the commonwealth, the nation, the international conventions, The church is the imperfect but actual and unique representative of the kingdom of God, which is not only an international but a universal community, having yet unrealized ideals but having also actual incorporation in this earth. The only part of the kingdom of God we know is what we see in the present world. Within all these communities we discover subgroups or classes having certain likenesses, needs, and interests, such as the abnormals, the defectives, the antisocial, all of them subsocial and in various degrees alienated from normal social relations and activities, and requiring from normal society special modes of treatment, each with its technique. The minister is not and cannot be a specialist in social science if he does his duty as a pastor. He will not be master of any particular department of public service. His youthful studies in this field must therefore be limited to the fundamental sciences, to the broad surveys, and to one or two fields of practice which will give him methods of observation and judgment. To secure this preparation begun in the high school, we need not neglect the essential disciplines of the divinity school. In the best schools of theology, time is conserved by pruning off minute investigations of dead issues, which this age has no time to discuss. The training of social workers. But the minister is not the only Christian leader in whose education the Christian community is interested. If the church is to be counted on as a force and an assistant in the modern world, it must recognize the variety of gifts, talents, and professions through which the Spirit reveals God to man and builds up the kingdom. Romans chapter 12, 1 Corinthians chapter 12. We are providentially called to teach and train Christian young men and women who will be specialists in the fields of public service and private philanthropy, teachers, investigators, statisticians, settlement residents, playground and social center directors, physical directors, secretaries of the YMCA, organizers of mutual benefit associations, advocates of social legislation, secretaries for social welfare work, officers of prisons, reformatories, and institutions for defective and abnormal persons, etc. Starting from our economic system, which is now characterized by freedom of contract, legal and political equality, private property secured by law and moral beliefs, with capitalistic management dominant, we come to the wage-earning class of operatives, the industrial group, with its own needs, interests, ideals, aspirations, and demands. A rudimentary class seems to be emerging in the second crop of capitalist manager families, the leisure class, with its own ideals, attitudes, fashions, activities, and models of influence. 2. Community interest. Associated effort, when it is conscious and intelligent, is directed toward common ends. Clear thinking and effective action depend on a distinct and well-grounded notion of social aims and ideals. These common interests are revealed by the conduct and institutions of men. They manifest their inward desires by their outward deeds. The analysis of human motives has been made by every writer on ethics from Aristotle and Plato to our own time. The two most elementary interests we share with animals, because they are essential to the existence of human beings: hunger and reproductive impulses. Summer adds vanity and fear, which also are manifested by our humbler fellow creatures. All these primitive desires cling to all men and cannot be totally extinguished by the most devout ascetic until senility or the paralysis of approaching death extinguishes the last flickering flame of exhausted nature. Hunger and love may be related, tamed, brought under legal, moral, and religious control, but they persist because without them the very race would soon disappear. In all social plans, these elemental forces must be reckoned with. Social regulation. In a state of society so clearly that no clear record has been left in document or on monument, men discovered that social life could not go on without some measure to secure order, safety of life and limb, and the possession of property. The evolution of government, of civil and criminal law, was caused by this necessity, which was even felt among the higher animals before humanity emerged. In our time, the recognition of these interests has given support to a vast and complex system of social control, direction, and regulation. Property. In order to support individual existence, to supply the needs of offspring, to add comforts and luxuries to necessities, to gratify vanity and desire for influence and distinction, men have combined to secure commodities. The acquisition of property is primarily the result of industry, of applying human wit and labor to the materials and forces of nature, but secondarily, property has been acquired by robbery and war, by cunning and fraud, by the mission of legal privilege and the exploitation of slaves, of women, of children, of ignorant men. The economic interest is at the root of all industries, trades, commerce, and finance, however complex these may become. Business has become an end for its own sake, the ultimate ends of life being forgotten in the eagerness of the pursuit, and thus wealth has in a measure lost connection with welfare, and the devotion to money has become idolatry. Culture interests. Culture interests are those which distinguish civilized men from the lower animals and from savage races. It is true that some law of beauty, goodness, and religion may be found in animals and in the lower races of mankind, for in the process of evolution there is no violent break with the past at any point. The spiritual not only arises from the natural, but gradually and imperceptibly out of the natural, as the flower out of the growing plant. But as distinctly characteristic and differentiated interests, art, science, morality, politics, and religion are achievements of the human spirit, and to these goods of civilization contributions have been made from the dawn of human consciousness. Here and there a man of genius has added something conspicuous and remarkable to these higher possessions, and the gift of his soul has become his monument. But inventions, languages, faiths, beautiful lines and forms, proverbs, folklore, moralities, legal conceptions are far more the result of the universal activities of humble and nameless human beings than of distinguished and famous leaders. The desires for these higher satisfactions become motives to social effort. Men combine in many ways to secure them, as in musical societies, clubs, schools, museum associations, local and general governments. The measure in which these satisfactions are enjoyed and the extent to which the people share in them give us a standard of civilization, a test of progress. Statistics furnish us with a scientific method of applying the standard to the actual working of institutions and laws. Social problems. These are the questions which men put to practical reason and science in regard to the best methods of stimulating, harmonizing, and universalizing the satisfactions of the social interests. The desires are found in all human beings. The scientific method of attaining the satisfactions must be adapted to the peculiarities of each group in the nation, and therefore each stage of evolution, each discovery and invention, each increase of population offers a new problem for solution. The solution must take into account the particular needs of each group in its relationship to all others of the nation. Social technique. To increase, universalize, and harmonize these satisfactions in each group requires a method of methods. There is a best and wisest and most effective way. It is the business of social science and statesmanship to discover this way. It is knowable, but never altogether known. The causal forces which explain the present may be utilized by human intelligence and concerted action to promote socially desirable ends. Theoretical social science culminates in discovery of causes, practical social science in a foundation of knowledge for desirable achievements. So far as the technique has been mastered in a high degree, it is best known by a body of specialists or experts, but usually it cannot be effectively carried into life without the intelligent cooperation of a considerable body of laymen. Hence, the need of popular education in social science, for science simply means common knowledge made as comprehensive, reliable, and systematic as possible, which is precisely that knowledge which is most effective in action and conduct. End of Chapter 11, Part 4. Recording by Danny Hogger, Fullerton, California, www.dannyhogger.com.
Chapter 11, Part 5 of Guide to the Study of the Christian Religion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Derek McLaughlin. Guide to the Study of the Christian Religion, edited by Gerald Birney Smith. Chapter 11, Christianity and Social Problems, Part 5. Christianity in relation to social problems. It remains to indicate the service which the Christian churches, as bearers of Christian thought and ideals, can render in the work of stimulating, universalizing, and harmonizing these efforts of the collective will to promote human welfare. The ideals of the Church. Only think what the Christian religion signifies. God so loved the world, loved all the people. As Creator, Father, Providence, Redeemer, Friend, our God, as Jesus taught, lives for us. He gives us life and the will to live, creates appetites and desires and provides for their satisfaction, and all He creates is essentially good. The Divine Spirit is at the heart of all our arts, sciences, reformations, the very ferment in all the restless agitation for improvement. The demagogue is a mere caricature of the evolutionary ambitions which seethe in human history. The end is abundant, rich, varied, many-sided, harmonious life. It is this infinite, creative, active, divine life which came to noblest expression in Jesus, which is manifested in the development of the human spirit and all its institutions, laws, governments. The kingdom of God has a more splendid aim than that of the conventicle of pietists intent on saving their own souls, a larger scope than ecclesiastical intrigue and ambition. If we could only set before us all that is required for the perfection of personality, for the order and progress of the world, for the quickening of intellectual curiosity, for the finest expression of beauty, for grace and courtesy, for intellectual mastery of the knowable universe through the sciences, for harmony, friendship, and worship, all this would be found at home within the idea of the kingdom of God. International law has statesmanship, but it is petty and provincial when compared with the universal realm opened up to us by the vision of Jesus, Son of God. It is for this idea that the Church stands, if only it could realize its unique and sublime task, if only its leaders could appreciate their role in relation to business and philanthropy, to artists, explorers, scientists, statesmen, philosophers, poets. The Church and its ministry have yet to learn how all-inclusive their mission is, how all the nations must bring their glory and honor into the city of God, whether they will it or not. We have been exclusive, self-centered, when we might have been inclusive, comprehensive, Catholic. We have desired to dominate and monopolize, when we were called to fraternal and sympathetic cooperation. We have abandoned vast fields of truth, art, power, as alien to our religion, when we might have transformed these forces and brought them into harmony with the highest ideals of faith. All things are yours, yet we deliberately surrendered our claim and called most of the precious values of humanity secular. The Church is not outside social problems. It is not benefactor or patron. It is not alien to the world. The Church lives upon industry. Its children are born from natural impulses in holy and legal wedlock. Its security is derived from government and law. Its ritual is enriched by poets and musicians. Its sins are those of its age. Its vision of truth is widened by science and education. Its morality is the best custom of the time. Its picture of heaven is composed of democratic and neighborly experiences of friendship. Its God is defined as Father or King. We as Christians are, like St. Francis, brothers of the poor and even of the birds, and we are here to cooperate with all men of good will. Here we must consider, first, the possible resources of the Church for this purpose; secondly, the defects of the Church and the explanation of these defects; thirdly, illustrations of progress in the Church toward realizing its duty and its opportunity; fourthly, the wisest direction for the near future. 1. Resources of the Church. The greatest book of life is the Bible, to whose exposition the Church is committed, and whose story of truth and faith is one of the chief forces of history. The Bible. So far as the Church is studying and teaching the Bible in a truly historic spirit and method, it is generating interest in human welfare. There are two tables of its law, reverence for God and regard for man. Both are assimilated and authorized in the golden rule of Jesus, and illustrated by his character and life. Inspiring personalities. So far as the Church, under the leadership of an educated ministry, knows its own history and holds before its children its heroes and martyrs, its missionaries and its philanthropists, it is generating fervor and zeal for sinning and suffering humanity. Church history and biography supply a magazine of ennobling and inspiring personal examples. Church history is a precious possession and a treasury of spiritual energy. Literature. Christian literature is a vast and fruitful store of motive to kindly and beneficent action. In hymns, poems, essays, in Dante, Luther, Milton, Tennyson, Browning, Shakespeare, Webster, Macaulay, in all the most powerful authors of Christendom there runs a deep Christian undertone. Christian literature is in a very high and true sense a continuation of the Bible. We need anthologies, source books, and a library of selections with historical annotations. Much of the written stuff of the Fathers and medieval theologians does not deserve the name of literature, and the people have not time to read it, nor money to buy it, nor house room to store it. Yet it is a pity to leave the jewels lost in the mass of rubbish, speculation, and superstition which makes up so much of the writings of the past. Only when the real classics in prose and verse have been selected and reprinted by competent scholars in chronological order, with historical sequences noted, will this spiritual inheritance of the Church come into its rightful place of power and influence. But God has not left himself without a witness in other lands of high culture. India, China, Japan, and even the proverbial philosophy of Africa have literary monuments of religion, and they also are ours to use and enjoy. The pitiful mediocrity of much contemporary so-called religious literature, its waste and desolation of miserable sectarian polemics, its obscurantism and dull platitudes, might well give way to the buried and forgotten literary treasures of the world. The personal influence of the members of the Church in the home and throughout the community. We may well count the personal influence of the members of the Church as an asset. Discount, with the severest justifiable criticism, the conduct of Christians, they are nevertheless the salt of the earth, the light of the world, though, unfortunately, they often hide their lamps under a bushel, and bury their talents out of sight. The exertion of influence reacts upon character, and he who earnestly endeavors to make his neighbors better instinctively criticizes his own standards and conduct. The army of church members are citizens and voters, masters of assemblies, judges on the bench, presidents and directors of corporations, members of clubs and associations, and trade union lawmakers and administrators, and this gives the Church access to every legitimate organization of the nation. Such a power is also a responsibility. Educational agencies. The educational equipment of the churches is enormous. All the modern systems of education and research grow out of ecclesiastical institutions of the Middle Ages. Cap, gown, and hood are reminders of the uniforms of learned monks of the ancient days when clergymen monopolized scholarship. Now we are on the way to the time when all God's people will be prophets, and democracy has taken over education and made it universal. But even now lay control does not imply irreligion. When the atmosphere is flooded with light, no window can open without admitting its radiance, and while Christianity shines everywhere, it will not be excluded from state institutions. We can therefore count practically all the agencies of science and education among the resources of the Church. One may gain some idea of the extent of these educational resources by taking the statistics from the report of the United States Commissioner of Education concerning schools, colleges, and universities under Church control. 2. Defects of the Church. The humane impulse of primitive Christianity is partly obscured and obstructed by fruitless and excessive speculation without ethical aim, by war for domination rather than by devotion to service, by ecclesiasticism and fanaticism, by making ceremony an end, by priestly ambition, by clinging to an excessive individualism and the laissez-faire philosophy and practice which was the idol of the 18th century. It is not agreeable for us to analyze our defects, yet it is wholesome and necessary. An ancient Greek statesman told the people, after a military defeat, that if they had done their utmost, he would despair of his country, but that they had not employed their best powers, and that if they would rally with all energy and devotion, the day could yet be saved and honor restored. The Church has amazing, undeveloped resources. Its wastes would furnish capital for world conquest. The correction of its errors and the joyful acceptance of its obligation would make it invincible. And therefore the loyal servants of the churches must deal with themselves critically and earnestly. Rather than bring indictments against one another, let us searchingly examine ourselves and revise our methods. Why should we not sincerely, earnestly, and without equivocation bring our leadership before the bar of impartial justice by asking ourselves such questions as these? Have we concentrated our studies and sermons on the essentials of Christianity, or have we lavished energy and time on topics in controversy among the faithful? If we should subordinate sectarian enterprises to the cause of missions in regions which have never heard of Jesus Christ and his gospel, would not millions of dollars be employed constructively rather than destructively? If the Christian people of a village or town would support one strong minister instead of starving 4 or 5 uneducated men, would there not be fewer mockers at the superstitions of the Church and more institutions of charity, rational recreation, and ennobling education? If the fanatical zeal which now divides Christendom into warring camps were to be devoted to improving the dwellings of working men and providing social centers for youth, would not the world's skepticism be changed into admiring faith? If Christianity were presented in revivals as a consecration to the cause of elevating and enriching man's estate, and not merely as a selfish and absorbing desire for individual salvation, would this not be a convincing demonstration of the divinity of the message? If a blue pencil were drawn through every line of sermons which did not tend to increase love, peace, justice, and wisdom, might not the discourses suffer only in length, while they improved in form and attractiveness? If ministers would exclude from their libraries the tomes which are unscientific or anti-scientific, the works which intensify bigotry and fill the head with errors and platitudes, might not many of the graduates of high schools and colleges be attracted to church attendance, who now remain away because they are amazed by the ineptitudes and anachronisms of a traditional and outworn teaching? Are there not hundreds of communities which lack public spirit, common aims, facilities for culture, because the churches remain apart and refuse to do teamwork? Are our ministers prepared by their education to grapple intelligently with the colossal moral problems of businessmen? And do they not too generally limit their instruction in righteousness to petty personal relations or to vociferous denunciations of the sins of ancient Israel? Are not the average businessman, farmer, and mechanic compelled to decide most of the problems of duty without any real intellectual help from the Church? How much of this failure is due to cowardice, or to ignorance, or to preoccupation with merely ecclesiastical or even clerical schemes which have not the slightest bearing on the matters of life and death, of daily anxiety, of inner spiritual struggle to know the right? How much is due to the conventional training of pastors, which still is under the influence of the monastic ideals which were nominally overturned by the Reformation? Whatever may be the causes, all who are not blind to the facts must see that the Church and the ministry are too small a factor in the ethical tumult and anarchistic struggles of our age, in spite of our resources. 3. Signs of promise. The day is breaking in the east, of which the prophets told, and brightens up the sky of time, the Christian's age of gold. It is more agreeable to call attention to the evidence that the leaders of the Church are awakening to a sense of their privilege and duty, and summoning the disunited hosts to cooperative action. The zeal for reformation. The apostolical succession of servants of humanity has never once been broken. In all ages, lofty spirits have protested against abuses and recalled Christians to the essentials of faith. In the darkest night of the ages, a flickering lamp burned on many a humble altar. The renaissance of a humane Christianity was not produced by individual saints, but it was the outgrowth of a life which was in the Church from the beginning, and which manifested itself in men of genius, and also in millions of gentle and obscure persons who lived without renown and rest in nameless graves. No one sect can claim the entire honor for this revival. The Roman Catholic Church has its galaxy of pure spirits, St. Francis, Elizabeth of Thuringia, St. Vincent de Paul, Frederick Ozanam, and many others. The Society of Friends, true to their name, gave us George Fox, Elizabeth Fry, William Penn, and the poet of the drab-skirt muse, John G. Whittier. The Methodist movement gave us the Wesleys. We hardly care to recall to which sect belonged Wilberforce, John Howard, the Earl of Shaftesbury, John Ruskin, Florence Nightingale, Octavia Hill, Thomas Carlyle, for they are just human. The Unitarians never could boast great numbers, but their William E. Channing and Theodore Parker compelled the ecclesiastical world to think of the working man, the slave, the drunkard, and they helped us all to see that an arbitrary and heartless tyrant, even if armed with omnipotence, cannot really be worshipped as God. Biblical criticism undermined the dogmatic foundations of the Church and compelled believers to seek refuge in God himself rather than in a book about him, or in a creed, however valuable these are as witnesses and instruments. German economists became our allies when they insisted, with Wagner and Schmoller, that gains must rest on a basis of justice, and that the iron law of supply and demand ought to be directed by a righteous and intelligent purpose. Missions. Foreign missionaries went out to save men from future punishment, and found the people in Africa and parts of the Orient in a present purgatory. Compassion for the multitude, who were as sheep without a shepherd, took possession of them, and while they told of God, heaven, and redemption, they taught the people to plough a deeper furrow, to weave a better cloth, to use quinine against malaria rather than sacrifice to devils, to treat women with courtesy, and to educate their children. Perhaps it could be shown that missionaries abroad were pioneers of the social work of the Church. Charles Dickens did something by holding up to ridicule those who sent blankets to the naked blacks of tropical Africa while they left starved children to freeze in the slums of London. But on the whole his caricature was unfair even then, and since he wrote, the methods of missions have been rapidly improved. Medical and educational missions have given a start to the modern movements in the Orient and brought countless millions to the door of hope and light. These inspiring works have not only been the most convincing demonstration of the divine life in Christianity, a veritable revelation of its essence, but they have reacted upon the methods of the churches at home and made them more sensible, practical, and persuasive. Cooperation and Federation. Over against the unhappy and wasting divisions of the Church, we set the establishment of powerful institutions which represent unity and cooperation. There have been various overtures from ecclesiastical dignitaries to the sects, with amiable invitations of the tiger to the kid to lie down inside, but these have not been taken seriously, however kindly meant. There have been conventions, conferences, eloquent speeches in favor of unity, not without some result. But the most direct and effective movements have let church union wait for some immediate, urgent, and imperative service to humanity. The temperance movement has brought together members of all denominations for the common defense of youth, virtue, and religion from the brutalities and degradation of the drink traffic. The Union Sunday School conventions and associations have mobilized the forces of the whole Christian Church for the religious education of youth, and the Religious Education Association has brought to this agency the resources of modern biblical scholarship and the art of education. The Young Men's Christian Association by no means satisfies the demands of modern fellowship. Its creed basis excludes many of the finest spirits of our faith, but it has gone as far as its supporters have yet been ready to go, and in the right direction. It has gradually developed a ministry to the whole man, body, mind, and spirit, and it seems nearly ready to move forward with due caution beyond individual aid into the field of public service. The Federal Council of the Churches of Christ is also restricted in its organization by the fears and traditions of godly men, and yet it also has brought into effective cooperation a vast multitude of members of the popular branches of the Christian communion. In several states the home missionary societies have advanced, only too slowly, to a position of comity, courtesy, and economy, where they refuse to subsidize the strife and vainglory of sectarianism. These movements, significant and valuable already, are still more hopeful in indicating the direction of future enterprises. 4. The wise direction of effort in the near future. The problems of the next century will be solved more easily if we attend strictly to our present urgent duty. The pillars and roof will be firm only as the foundation is sure. The requirements of social welfare in the present age are determined by the facts of this age as already sketched. The Church cannot and ought not to work out a separate program of its own. The consensus of experts in each branch of social science is the nearest possible indication of duty. The isolation of the Church makes its efforts barren. The leaven must be mixed with the dough. The seed must be buried in the soil. Even Catholic Europe has frequently abolished monasteries, and it would be atavistic return to barbarism to adopt a monastic or conventical ideal for the Church. The duty of the leaders of the Church is to become acquainted, as well as they can, with the best methods known for advancing the physical, economic, and spiritual welfare of the home, the neighborhood, the town, the commonwealth, the nation, the world. The beginning of wisdom is to know more, and to cease to waste time on idle controversy and speculation. We shall find inspiration, worship, in the Bible, but we must seek duty in the relations of the age in which the Creator has placed us, as our fathers sought for it in their situation. The day of domination of the state by ecclesiastical authority has passed. Clerical interference in political parties is resented, and rightly, because clergymen have no professional qualifications for this task. But there never was an age when religion and religious personalities were more needed as an influence, when the Church had such a splendid opportunity to inspire men of action and power with hope, faith, and charity in their colossal and often discouraging tasks. The characteristic social task of the Church ministry of religion. The Church, with its ministry, has the most vital part in social service. It must have a theology which honest and intelligent men can understand and believe. It must help people to a reasonable moral view of God. It must have something wise and persuasive to say about the divine, about sin, prayer, the hope of immortality. To help men to see God is the highest and most precious social service. The Church must keep alive this belief until the whole world is civilized and refined enough to appreciate it. In doing this work, science must be respected in its field. No doctrine of faith or prayer or miracle must contradict the universality of the causal principle on which all knowledge rests. We must not ask a man of science to stultify his reason in order to worship and hope. We must teach men to find God everywhere, and not merely in the inaudible, exceptional, and extraordinary. We must be rid of magic, and keep mysticism in its place as poetry, and learn the ways of science. The seer and the poet and the preacher need not fear exact knowledge, if each remain true to his own call. The essence of theology is its doctrine of friendship as the spirit of the universe. All the arts of music, liturgy, oratory, poetry, painting, architecture, sculpture, city planning are most glorious when they help humanity to trust, to hope, to love. And the Church holds a unique place in this world of beauty and idealism. No newspaper, no secular or ethical club can ever compete with it, if it knows how to help men to see God, to love and reverence Him, to exult in hope. The promotion of social reforms. In the improvement of physical, economic, and political conditions, the churches have a different duty to perform, and a less direct. But what they can do is great and is urgently needed. Sermon, song, and teaching may quicken the conscience, kindle pity, compassion, remorse, and kindness. At this point, the study of social science will furnish the church leaders with an inexhaustible supply of illustrations, long after books of religious anecdotes and feathers for arrows have been worn out. The newspapers and magazines paint stories, but they lack the fire of religious fervor to give momentum to sacrificial endeavor, and newspapers cannot organize institutions and train workers as the church can. Numerous groups of scientific specialists exist who possess knowledge, but who have comparatively few votes. The federated churches have millions of voting members, with vast and widely diffused political influence over the entire nation, but they have no authority in social science. A good understanding between the expert groups and the multitudes who profess a religion of benevolence and justice would be fruitful, and it seems to be at hand. The American Association for Labor Legislation, the American Prison Association, the National Conference of Charities and Correction, the National Child Labor Committee, the Consumers League, and others have long invited the cooperation of pastors, recently with much success. The Church has opportunities of instruction in social duties which belong to no other institution. The sermon can do something, but cannot deal with technical problems. Discussions in social meetings, classes, and societies are the most effective means of training the members to think socially, to consider the claims of justice in all relations of life. The social evangelist may have his uses, as the individualistic revivalist, if sane, has his place, but the serious and lasting work will be done in small groups of careful students, for educated leaders are afraid of the mob mind and seek quiet discussion. The leaders of these groups must ultimately be trained for their task in colleges and universities. They will be specialized ministers of churches. Groups of churches will combine to support them. One competent man in a populous county could direct the serious discussions of hundreds of leaders under a proper system of cooperation. It would be absurd to require that every pastor should be competent to guide studies over such vast fields. The Church will learn to specialize in religious leadership just as the universities, the great industries, and all other successful organizations have done. The need of workers. Yet it will be entirely possible, and it is highly desirable, that all educated men and women, ministers included, during their course of instruction in secondary school, college, and professional school, should receive preparation for intelligent cooperation in the works of good citizenship. A curriculum has already been arranged for the accomplishment of this purpose, as mentioned above, and it includes a liberal provision for language, science, history, and literature. The Church can send laborers into the harvest, theological students, a few, but multitudes of others. There is not an effective society of philanthropy which does not cry out, often in vain, for helpers. These helpers must be prepared for their duties, and there are educational institutions prepared to give the necessary instruction and training for social service. Many churches could select promising young people and provide for their professional education as directors of playgrounds, probation officers, charity visitors, librarians with the missionary spirit, social secretaries, teachers in reform schools, managers of clubs for youth, residents in settlements. Social politics. The most perplexing problems before the Church which undertakes to exert any influence whatever on social politics and the material and cultural interests of the wage earners are those of trade unions and socialism. The problem of the liquor traffic is comparatively simple, because the financial interests involved are so plainly in recognized antagonism to order, security, health, morals, and religion. But the labor question divides the nation into two camps, and there is no present outlook for agreement. So far as charity is concerned, there is no very bitter controversy, except when the philanthropists regard it as a substitute for justice, and settle down in contented satisfaction with their alms deeds. Scientific charity itself in our time dispels the illusion of the finality of gifts, and its matter-of-fact records point to low wages, exhausting toil, poisonous air in workshops, reckless disregard of life in mines and on railways, unequal taxation and tax dodging, exploitation of consumers and laborers, as among the chief causes of misery, the extravagance of the poor and alcoholism having been greatly exaggerated in this connection. Welfare work. Welfare work on the part of employers, as an expression of sincere kindness, awakens some protest, and is not received with enthusiastic satisfaction by the working men. They regard it, in the main, as an element of minor importance, even when it is not used to distract working men and win them away from their own unions. The real issue is one which we are loath to face, and one which we can meet only with adequate knowledge, sympathy, and sober judgment. Who is to control the conditions of labor and the distribution of the product? Socialism. The scheme of socialism needs to be understood by Christian leaders, for nothing does greater harm than misrepresentation. Common objections to socialism are that it would mean equality of income, destruction of the right to hold and enjoy private property, perhaps community of wives and rearing of children by the state, atheism, a monotonous dead level of culture. None of these things belongs to the essence of socialism, although various socialistic writers have indulged in all sorts of adventures in these directions. Any definition of socialism is likely to be challenged, but perhaps we may say that the essence of socialism is the demand that all wealth used for social production should be under social control. This means that the managers of industry, commerce, and banking should be employees of the Commonwealth, and responsible to the people for their conduct of affairs. It would be the extension of control by representatives of the people, not only over law and government, but over business. The product of industry would not be divided at the will of capitalist managers, nor by vote of the operators in particular industries, but under control of representatives of the entire public. Apparently there is no immediate prospect of this radical and revolutionary scheme being carried out, but there is a marked tendency to realize the principle of social control one step at a time, as in the supervision of powerful corporations by public utilities commissions, the Interstate Commerce Commission and courts, municipal ownership and management of water works, streetcars, gas and electric works, the Federal Post Office, parcel post, and Federal Telegraph and Telephone Service, obligatory insurance of all kinds under public regulation. The whole system of public inspection and regulation of factories, mills, mines, and railways to protect the life, limb, and health of employees is an expression of a determination to use the power of the government to restrict the arbitrary and irresponsible abuse of power by capitalist managers. The swift extension of social insurance means, in part, taking profits and dividends to add to wages, giving to the men who work hardest and suffer most a more adequate support and share in the heritage of civilization. Social insurance means that life is to be made secure and free from deadly worry and gaunt care, without dependence on uncertain and humiliating charity. Common wealth. The multiplication of public libraries, parks, museums, and schools signifies that modern democracy intends to bring the blessings of the higher realms of culture within reach of every living soul. The condemnation of crowded and insanitary dwellings is a policy widely accepted, and it will include municipal ownership of houses wherever the self-interest of capital fails to provide decently for the homes of men. The federal income tax, with its exemptions of the poor and its progressively increasing levy on superfluous revenues, is an expression of the determination of the people to curb and restrict luxury so long as millions of manual laborers have not enough to eat. Inheritance taxes have more than a mere financial purpose. They are a means deliberately adopted for the redistribution of earned and unearned fortunes, and a notice to the heirs of wealth, who toil not nor spin, that it will be well for them to learn a trade. In all this economic movement there is something deeper and nobler than physical hunger. There is a sense of justice, an ideal of brotherhood. Such legislation is too calm, steady, and secure of its aim to be under control of envy and revenge or anarchistic passion. It is the largest, finest, and most effective method of expressing solidarity, fraternity. So far from being a brief madness, this policy is the slow growth of centuries of discussion, and gradually has changed sentiments, customs, laws, and constitutions in all civilized lands. Perils of progress. While leaders of the Christian Church should study these modern policies intelligently and sympathetically, they should also be critical and able to understand the perils and difficulties of reform, especially of a radical and revolutionary plan like socialism. For direct popular control and administration of the complex industries of modern times, the masses of the people are yet unprepared. The difficulty of securing competent managers of large affairs is seen in the failure of many of our political ventures in industrial fields. We must get our training as we travel forward, and must learn from our mistakes, but the general direction of progress is made clear by noting the historical movement for social control over a period of several centuries. Fellowship in religion, the crown of all progress. Social service culminates in the fellowship of religion. Religion does indeed, as we have insisted, stimulate us to love all our fellow men, to do good as we have opportunity, to use all our resources and all institutions to promote the economic, physical, aesthetic, scientific, political well-being of mankind. Thus far, religion is a powerful means to a noble and rational end, toward which God himself is working with us and in us. And the Church, as the chief school of religion, cannot neglect the task of applying religious influences in the cause of humanity. Yet religion is a good in itself, and the highest, not merely a means to promote other ends. And the specific, characteristic function of the Church is not that of promoting science, art, or preventive medicine. There are special institutions for each of these worthy objects, and the Church has no call to meddle with their administration. As one of my honored colleagues has said, "We need the Church, a community of men in which we interchange the faith of our heart in living mutual fellowship with the hearts of other men. The certitude of our faith depends upon the discernment of itself in others' hearts. The endearment of our faith is increased by seeing the enlargement of our faith. The very satisfactions which are achieved by the functions of religion can become our possession only in case that religion be not means, but end as well." The climax of the social service of the Master was not in healing the sick and giving sight to the blind, but in preaching the gospel to the poor. And who are so poor as the rich who know not God? End of chapter 11, part 5. Chapter 12, Part 1 of Guide to the Study of the Christian Religion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Derek McLaughlin. Guide to the Study of the Christian Religion, edited by Gerald Birney Smith. Chapter 12, The Contribution of Critical Scholarship to Ministerial Efficiency. Part 1, The Method of Modern Education. The essentials of a school are teachers and students. According to our new education, the primary office of the teacher is to teach, not thoughts or things, but human beings. He is not a superior being whose aim is to impart authoritative information to inferiors, sustaining to him the appropriate attitude of submission, passivity, and docility. Renouncing aristocratic aloofness, he becomes his student's guide and friend, developing their energy, independence, initiative, and resourcefulness. Learning by doing is the slogan in our modern schools, as against the old watchword of learning by being told or taught. Accordingly, pupils are put in direct relation with reality instead of with symbols of reality. The content of life and environment is the subject matter which they study. It is not that the student is immediately fitted for some trade or vocation or profession, but that the material which he examines and elaborates is drawn from actual life itself. The new education aims to give neither mere book learning, as was the case with an earlier scholasticism, nor the narrow and technical vocational training, as the present-day secularist craves, but to develop mind and body, to stimulate inventiveness, and to cultivate a judicial temper and habit, in order that the student may be prepared to become a happy and useful member of a democratic society. In a word, our new general education assimilates itself to the spirit of democracy and to the method of our sciences. Now, in what respect, if in any, does professional or vocational education differ from our ordinary education? By a professional school is meant an institution where students gain control of one specialized field of knowledge, of one particular industry or profession or calling, such, for example, as engineering or medicine or divinity. Professional schools, their history reveals this, have usually fallen into the extremes of an inherited scholastic bookishness, or else of a narrow utilitarian practicism. To illustrate in the use of theology, this discipline was knowledge dissociated from life, a thing worth while on its own account, or else it was little more than drill in the usages and ceremonies of the Church. In ages of rationalism and panlogism, it tended to be the former. It was the latter in primitive and medieval times. It may be doubted whether medicine and law are second to theology as exemplars of these extremes. In opposition to this scholastic education apart from active life, or this technical education apart from broad learning, the new education of the ordinary schools unites ideas and practice, work and the recognition of the meaning of what is done, learning and social applications. Happily, the conviction is maturing today that this unity should replace those theoretical and practical one-sidednesses in our professional education, that, advancing into the region of specialism, the matter of most importance is not familiarity with the body of ready-made knowledge, or skill in manipulating a technique, but knowing how to know, skillful in becoming skillful. At bottom, this means the formation of the kind of character and experience which, in their special modification, are required for the enthusiasm and service of humanity in that special profession. Thus, the primary function of any professional school is the unfolding and maturing of the right kind of man for the right kind of work. Both the school's science and practice are simply means to that end. It is neither the knowledge nor the practice in their abstractness, but the knowing and doing personality that is society's valuable asset. Now, it is in the light of such considerations as these that the serious problems of our theological education may be approached. Calling and vocation. There is a distinction, not philological, but historical and real, between the words calling and vocation. The significance of this distinction leads to the heart of our problem, so worthy of thus studying in a large way. Historically speaking, calling is providential, vocation is optional. Calling is religious, vocation is moral. Calling is a man's by motives deeper than his choice, wiser than his deliberations. Vocation is a man's by his own elective preference. In calling, a minister feels that he is a man of destiny. Woe is me if I preach not the gospel. I was foreordained and set apart from my mother's womb for this work, a work in which the power of the eternal is at my disposal, is indeed my power. Without this feeling, the minister is sure to be shorn of his strength and robbed of his greatness among men. But in vocation one is looked upon as self-dependent, self-sufficient, self-accountable. To be sure, calling and vocation are not exclusive, but the objective and subjective, rather the divine and the human side of the same experience. But historically they have fallen asunder. At the beginning of the modern world, Luther and Calvin both looked upon a man's work, no matter what it was, as his calling, as his by the providential will of God. Thus a man's work reposed on a religious basis. Men were what they were, doing what they did, by the power and plan and purpose of God. Such a conviction brought strength and stay and contentment. But in the 18th century the religious basis of all secular callings was undermined. The relative historical justification of this critical dissolution does not concern us here. The fact is that, along with science and art and education, the other orders of life dispensed with their religious foundation, and that capital, machinery, and technique came in to take their place. Accordingly, faith in the fulfillment of one's daily task came to repose in the latter rather than in the former. In all this one may see progress in a certain direction. Perhaps the heavens had to be emptied and clouded for a time if men were to realize that they must stand upon the earth, develop the resources of the earth, and depend upon themselves. Yet this loss of the religious basis of secular callings is largely responsible for the sorry fruits of egoism and mammonism, of cynicism and pessimism. It may not be too much to say that the world of business needs nothing so much as to add to the confidence in technique and machinery and money the ancient faith in God, with his providential guidance over men's work and his peace and power in men's hearts. Labor needs to supply to its notion of vocation its former notion of calling. It watches, but it also needs to pray. The secularization of the minister's profession. Has an analogous development gone on in the sacred calling of the Christian ministry? Once there was the religious basis without machinery and capital, not even a salary. The ministry was calling, conscious of God's power and will, God's truth and cause, God's providence. The minister spoke with authority to the consciences and hearts of men. There was an accent of positive conviction that could not be simulated or mistaken. Men were made to face the tables of stone, the cross, and the great white throne. A supernatural significance and awe attached to human life as a probationary place of definitive and eternal decisions. The prophet and priest of God was a king among men. What has been going on? The sacred calling is duplicating in its own way the experience of the secular calling. The calling becomes a vocation. To be sure, this is but a moment in the total secularization of all life, which seems to be the set program of the modern world. The sacred calling is becoming desupernaturalized and, in a sense, despiritualized. So is its technique. But one sees in this great change the method of the evolutionary process fully illustrated. Life, characteristic of one era, survives increasingly unproductive and moribund, in the subsequent period committed to new growths and species. At length, such life of the old order ceases in fact, as it had already ceased in principle. This is true in the sphere of the higher life and processes of which we are thinking. Thus, in principle, though not yet entirely in fact, the divinity of the historic sacraments is gone, and of ministerial grace from ordaining hands. Gone is the origin of the sermon in the Holy Ghost, the open your mouth and it shall be filled theory of preaching, the naive and primitive trust in divine afflatus. Gone is the preacher's living upon the capricious gratuities and donations of a flock, who felt that it was their place to keep him poor, God's to keep him humble, both prerogatives now arrogated to themselves. More serious still, the divinity of his church and of the doctrines and morals of his sermons, of the head of the church, of the specific God of his theology, These too are gone, and with them the old miraculous supernaturalism of regeneration and sanctification and perfection. Indeed, these words are quite unintelligible to the modern man on the street, and almost obsolete in the terminology of the theologian. What is taking the place of all this that once constituted the religious basis of the ministerial calling? In part, technique, machinery, capital, especially organization, with the correlate of scientific efficiency of the churches in manipulating them. The dream is of a scientific ministry instead of the old religious ministry. The minister is not so much prophet and priest of God as an administrative officer of a philanthropic and humanitarian institution endowed by capital, which he is competent to execute. The church is not a temple, but a plant. The idea seems to be gaining favor that if men are fed and clothed and sheltered and washed and amused, they will not need to be redeemed with the old terrible redemption. In somewhat harsh antithesis, to be sure, one may say that not supernatural regeneration, but natural growth; not divine sanctification, but human education; not supernatural grace, but natural morality; not the divine expiation of the cross, but the human heroism, or accident, of the cross; not the supernatural spiritual brother, but the natural bodily brother; not the invisible religious communion of saints, living and dead, but boys' clubs and men's clubs and social settlements, all run in the use of technique, machinery, and capital, with scientific efficiency clinically learned in a divinity school; and not Christ the Lord, but the man Jesus, who was a child of his times; not God and his providence, but evolution and its process without an absolute goal; that all this, and such as this, is the new turn in the affairs of religion at the tick of the clock. It is the change that is going on from the old minister to the new, from the old church to the new. The advantages of modern methods. Now, is this progress? In a sense, yes. It was progress in the secular. The machine makes shorter hours possible, leaving time for possible personal improvement and social intercourse. A larger population can be provided for, and so forth. The same is true of the church with modern appointments and appliances, money and organization. We have but to think of how much better religion can be taught in the use of modern pedagogy, or of how much more systematically and wisely scientific charities can be administered, of how organized parish visitations can be carried on, of how the problem of the boy can be solved, of how church services can be conducted with beauty and finesse. All this is good and will doubtless grow better. Besides, the beliefs of the church which constitute the substance of the sermon are readjusted to fit more harmoniously into the sum of modern convictions. We shall not be able to go back behind all this in the world of the church, any more than in the world of business. The dangers of secularization. But, for all that, we have the problem on our hands in the secular world as to whether machine and capital are primary, and personality and humanity secondary, or whether it is the other way round, the problem of whether man is for the sake of vocation, or vocation for the sake of man, the problem of man's spirituality and freedom and worth. But this problem can never be solved until there is the restoration of the long-lost religious basis of secular life. It is not science, it is faith, the communion of all men in and with God, that can make man the Lord and not the slave of capital and machine and organization. Only so can there cease to be the hard dominion of thing over person. Once again the laborer must return to the conviction that his vocation is a calling, his calling by the will and providence of God. A similar relationship needs to be maintained in the world of the sacred between the primary worth of personality and the instrumentalities and institutions of the church. The real church of God is the spiritual and invisible communion of religious faith. The real church of God is super-institutional. As man, any man, is more than a member of society, is super-social from the point of view of a social organism, that is a child of God, so the calling of the minister is more than so-called social service, and has to do with that deep of man which cries unto the deep of the being of God. There was a lonely hour at the brook Jabbok, when Jacob's family and flock were out of his mind, the peril of his angry brother forgotten, his heart corroded by no mordant memory, a lonely hour in which he cried, Tell me, I pray thee, thy name, the ineffable name. He wanted to know the eternal mystery and meaning of existence. Not so-called social service, but the ministry of the interpretation and the satisfaction of this inexpugnable and abysmal need of man is the supreme and inalienable function of the Christian minister. And this is a work where the peculiar worth of personality, religious personality, entirely dissociated from all the technique and machinery and capital of the whole ecclesiastical entity, is paramount. It were well to realize in thought what a reduction of human nature and human need there would be were man to be abridged to a point where what could be done for him by social service, with its instrumentalities, could satisfy him. Man has untranslatable wealth, supervocational vastness and verities and relationships. So has the minister, and it is this supervocational overplus that is the best part of the minister, and that lends chief charm and value even to the minister's vocational activity itself. The value and the danger of efficiency. It is in the light of this larger perspective that one can evaluate the most characteristic watchword of the modern world, efficiency. The educational and ecclesiastical circles have borrowed it from the commercial world. It must be admitted that there is much value in the maxim. It is opposed to sloth. In the concentration and solidification which it requires, it discourages the spirit that reflectively divides the inner self and leaves it divided. And it emphasizes courage. To be sure, it is the courage to face rivals in the marketplace rather than the courage that meets one's own spiritual enemies. But for all that, we know in our hearts that this modern watchword is profoundly unsatisfactory in every sphere of life, particularly in the Christian ministry. What this watchword does not emphasize is the significance of self-possession, of lifting up our eye to the hills whence cometh our help, of testing the life that now is by the vision of the largest life that we can image and appreciate. In a way that appeals to a superficial populace with quantitative standards, it emphasizes results rather than ideals, vigor rather than cultivation, temporary success rather than wholeness of life, the greatness of him that taketh a city rather than of him that ruleth his spirit. It points to a shallow pragmatism, missing the pragmatic depths. In its current signification, it is not correlated to man's deepest needs which, from the point of view of this word, are super-efficient. Men are indeed suffering from poverty and dirt and disease, from manifold industrial and social evils. The minister must indeed sustain positive relations to these evils. But the worst evil is not such sufferings. The worst evil is spiritual destitution. Men are suffering far more from the loss of God and of the moral imperative than from the lack of bread and work, of recreation and amusement. What can silence the voice of the heart's pain? What can introduce a man defeated, lonely, bereaved, defenseless, into the region of eternal truth, eternal rest, eternal peace? Efficiency cannot answer such questions. These are questions common to all time. But our time is indeed an age of doubt, more widespread and more basic than the premature prognosticators of an age of faith seem to be aware of. The New World began in doubt. First, there was a doubt of the Church and of its divine authority. A violent, devastating storm swept over popular life. The storm was speedily exorcised. Again, the sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. Then from the old doubt a new faith emerged, like sweet waters in a bitter sea, and kept man a living soul. The sea is calm tonight, the tide is full. The tide of the new faith was the faith in the Bible, and in the doctrines derived from the Bible, but this tide went back to sea, and now one only hears its melancholy, long, withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. The human spirit urged a new, mightier protest against the "it is written," which was said to put an end to all doubt. The new doubt, as Protestant science, as free inquiry, flung down the gauntlet to the old Bible faith. No page of the sacred book remained unscrutinized. Only one certainty spread from this new doubt, the certainty that the sacred book was a human book. Therefore, allowing and ever rejoicing in the moral and religious value of many a page, the biblical canon as such had no right to rule over man. Man was the book's judge, and the book was not man's judge. The book must be measured by man's truth, man's conscience. The modern experience of doubt. How now should the timorous heart of man be quieted in the presence of this new doubt? At once new props were offered. For one thing, the state. What the church was to the medieval man, the state became to the modern man, God manifest in the flesh. Men believed in their state as in their Christ. All power in heaven and on earth seemed to be given to it. What was preached in the name of the state was a gospel. It seemed a sin to doubt the wisdom of the state at all. It was blasphemy to contest the state's claim to omnipotence. Good? What is good, if not that which benefits the state? True? But where is there truth apart from the word that is the ipse dixit of the state? The political end sanctifies any means. Then a great change began. Historical study and the doctrine of development, together with the new ideals of personality and humanity, decomposed the old theory of the state. Modern man came to see that the state does not possess eternal life. The state is only a special form in which human social life can exist, not human society itself. There have not always been states. They came to be in the long course of the evolution of a people's life. What comes to be must pay its toll to Father Time. The state will change and pass. Thus its inerrancy and finality were discredited. If we doubt the church, why not the state too? Man's tottering life could not be braced up by either. Then new props were offered man. What science recognized as true, what morals and bourgeois customs recognized as good, these were offered him. Trust the light of science, and you shall indeed have the light of life. Do what is good, and you shall indeed be crowned with the crown of life. This was the watchword. Then there stirred in the womb of present-day humanity the last, ultimate, uncanniest doubt. If we doubt faith, why not doubt science too? If we doubt the church, the Bible, the state, why not doubt reason, doubt knowledge, doubt morality? Even if what we call true be really true, can it make us good and happy? Is not that which is called good grievous impediment in our pilgrimage? Law, morals, are not these perhaps a blunder of history, an old hereditary woe with which humanity is weighted down? Was Stendhal right, perhaps, in his judgment that the only excuse for God is that he does not exist? Here is the agony of the modern world. But what can our current efficiency do here? Efficiency with its technique and machinery and money and organization. At this point the tragedy of life passes beyond the help of such things and of institutional religion. Is there no help for lost souls any more? The minister who cannot cope with this deepest need of the modern man may organize superficial and often impertinent reforms, but he cannot give the bread of life. He may minister to bodily wants, good enough in its way, but he leaves the soul in its bewilderment and forsakenness. In the end he loses confidence and abandons his fundamental task. Our fathers thought of the Christian minister as prophet, priest, and king. This watchword efficiency tends to restrict the ministerial function to that of king. But the need of the times, as of all times, is satisfied more fully by prophet and priest. In sum, the great question is not that of efficiency, but the criterion of efficiency. It would be the minister's sin against the Holy Ghost, which hath never forgivenness, were he to truncate and abridge the nature and need of man, so that our institutionalized religion of scientific efficiency could sustain an easy correlation thereto. End of Chapter 12, Part 1. Chapter 12, Part 2 of Guide to the Study of the Christian Religion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Derek McLaughlin. Guide to the Study of the Christian Religion, edited by Gerald Birney Smith. Chapter 12, The Contribution of Critical Scholarship to Ministerial Efficiency. Part 2, The Task of Theology. Thus conceiving the function of the ministry in the terrible religious situation of the modern world, the utility of the study of theology in our divinity schools may be estimated. Theology is the science of faith, of religion. Of this statement much more needs to be said than can be said here. While science and religion are both expressions and aids of human life, they are different in form and function. Briefly expressed, religion experiences, science calculates. Religion creates, science discovers. Religion ventures, science weighs. Science avails itself of concepts and categories and laws, religion of symbols and pictures and parables. Assuming that theology is a science, a practical difficulty at once confronts us. Can theology be at once scientific and ecclesiastical? From the ecclesiastical point of view, the aim of theology has been to clarify and increase the Christian's intelligence as regards the content of his faith, to evince the living power of the Christian religion, and to bring this home to bear upon life through preaching, teaching, and Christian communion. From the scientific point of view, theology seeks to be free from the control and needs of the Church, to be determined solely by the truth interest, by the impulse to know reality, and to regard no law but its own, and no authority save the compulsion of its subject matter. Since the second Christian century, those two poles, the ecclesiastical and the scientific, have never vanished, but it may be doubted whether they have ever been in equilibrium. Usually the one has been emphasized at the expense of the other. Indeed, theology is usually under a crossfire from both science and faith, disowned by science, distrusted by faith. One may recall its medieval dignity as queen of the sciences, as science was then understood, but since the rise of the modern scientific method, theology came to be but compassionately tolerated by the representatives of the exact sciences, doubted by many of its own representatives, and incriminated by the laity as the primary cause of all the evils with which the Church of the present was infested. It was thought that in satisfying the requirements of science, theology betrayed the interests of religion. Hence the question became acute. Can theology be at once scientific from the point of view of science, and serviceable from the point of view of practicable Christianity? Is the study of theology a sufficient or even a suitable preparation for the office of preacher and pastor? Does theology destroy the preacher's message, lower the preacher's piety, impair the preacher's usefulness? Facing the problem thus fundamentally, one may be permitted to dismiss certain superficial or captious objections. For example, it is pointed out that the scientific study of theology in a divinity school has occasionally impelled students to abandon the ministry. Such abandonment may be due to the popular theology and nominal Christianity in which he was indoctrinated before he went to the divinity school. Or the student, as was the case with Emerson and Kant and Hegel, may enter upon a larger human service than that which a local church could afford. Besides, the occasional abandonment of the ministry under the influence of scientific theology does not discredit such theology, if it is seen to be in general useful, any more than would be the case in the analogous situation of law or medicine. But if it be true, as sometimes true it is, that now and then a theological student makes shipwreck of faith, even this disaster does not constitute a decisive objection, since this is a world where such shipwreck is possible from many causes, one of them being the absence of sound theological training. Other objectors ask, why is it that so many students who have studied scientific theology cannot preach? It might not be amiss to inquire whether they could preach if they had not studied scientific theology. As a rule, the academic and technical character of the young minister wears away as the years bring him experience and maturity, suffering and sorrow of his own, sickness and death of others. His fault is more likely to be a neglect of theological study than a bad use of it. But we may pass by such objections and return to the main issue. Theology and vocational demands. Let us assume that theology is, in method, a pure science, in purpose an applied science, avoiding the extremes of academic bookishness and of the narrow practicalism of efficiency. Let us grant, as the truth interest requires us to grant, that the purity must not be adulterated by the application. Pure science is free science, and, in Hegelian phrase not to be pragmatically flouted, has the theoretical self-end of knowledge. Now, by virtue of this very character of theological science, is there some service which it may render the ministry? A science which serves the self-cognition of spirit serves thereby one of the supreme practical ends of life, which is self-realization of spirit. Only an officially infallible church can do without the aid of such science. Ministers, like politicians, are especially tempted to debasement of the truth interest, to sham learning, sham religion. The great sin of ministers can easily be the infraction of the ethics of the intellect. Theological science is developing a fine sincerity in our relation to both theology and religion. Such honesty and sobriety of judgment are among a minister's best assets in our age of doubt. They go toward the formation of personality, which is at once the primary need of man and the main concern of all education. Should theology be restricted to the so-called applied, or, better perhaps, vocational sciences, as some divinity schools seek to do, a problem of no little gravity would arise. Would the new vocationally determined science be any more free and pure than the old authoritatively determined science? Is not a post-determined science, by an end externally imposed, as prejudicial to the critical occupation of the scientific spirit as a predetermined science by a cause or authority which proscribes freedom and dictates conclusions? Is the pull of an alien finalism any better than the push of an alien mechanism? If authority science gives doctrine and not truth, does not vocation science give practice and not truth? There is something here that should be borne in mind, lest we impair the truth interest, so inalienable to our highest life as students and ministers. Extremes meet, and it would be an ugly situation were authority and vocation to combine upon us in such a way that our natural impulse to know should be wounded and weakened. This evil may be avoided by honoring the study of scientific theology as corrective and supplementation of vocational science, ever inclined to deteriorate to an immediate and narrow professionalism. The need of the scientific spirit in theology. But theology in all its branches, historical, psychological, philosophical, as pure science, does serve the vocational ends of the ministry, even if it does not directly and consciously aim to do so. For one thing, it is indispensable to a reasoned understanding of what religion really is. In defining anything, one speedily turns to see how it came to be and what it is for. Thus, one knows a religious idea or a religious deed only as one sees how it has historically and psychologically emerged, and what function it fulfills in a people's or an individual's life. Besides, one requires to know the relation between idea and action in religion, the order of the emergence of magic, cult, myth, idea, doctrine, and their relations to each other. Especially does one need to know how to face the problem as to what is primary and what secondary and impermanent in religion. It appears that religion is not exhausted as a short circuit to the real by way of instinct and feeling. The science of religion shows that there is a deep truth in this. Most of the best things in life are rooted in instinct, which is perhaps just another way of saying that we are still ignorant of their precise conditions and causes. But religion, if it is worthwhile, is not merely a matter of instinct and emotion. It is a legitimate part of man's rational nature. The substance of religion is not in the ceremonies and creeds and institutions which have been built up in connection with church, but in man's consciousness that the best part of him lies in his ideals and in his earnest and sincere efforts to realize these ideals. It is the recognition that the spiritual center of gravity of his life lies not in what he is or has been, but in what he feels that he ought to become. The only study that leads us into this most needful insight for our work as preachers is that of scientific theology. But, for another thing, such study yields impressive testimony to the human cry for God. That cry, whether joyous and triumphant, or painful, pathetic, poignant, reverberates from land to land and from century to century. The very import of human history is its mysterious and universal urgency and awfulness. Whether it be the vague cosmological gropings of a primitive animism with its crass anthropomorphizing of duty and personification of inanimate objects, whether it be the passionate searching out of concepts or essences by Socrates, Plato, and the scholastics, with their confident assurance of the existence of an archetypal reality, whether it be the blended love and fear with which the intense and mystical Semites worshipped Yahweh and dared finally in the greatest of the Hebrews to claim divinity itself, whether it be the masterful executive ability with which the medieval ecclesiastics sought to embody a spiritual world in a temporal, even in a political hierarchy. Whether it be the refreshing directness with which the Protestants sought to re-establish an immediate relation of the believer with his God, whether it be the pathetic attempts of modern apologists to reconcile Genesis and Darwinism, or the wistful admission of the man of science that he has scanned the heavens with his telescope and found not God, whether it be one or all of these earnest and honest endeavors of man to understand his world and his own experience, the study of theology makes us recognize throughout, always and everywhere, the search for the unity and continuity of the life and love of man with an eternal and fatherly God. The value of this world-old and world-wide witness to the minister of religion is obvious. It is quite the fashion in some modern circles to pride oneself on one's unbelief, though why what one does not believe should be so admirable is not so immediately evident. It is much more to the point, one would think, to pride oneself on the number of truths one had found at the core of current superstitions. But it is only through the study of theology in all its branches that one acquires the judgment and skill to make such discoveries. How does the scientific study of theology equip the preacher? With these general considerations in mind, we may very well close by isolating for special remark those specific questions which were raised a moment ago. The first of those questions is the effect of the study of theology upon the definite message of the preacher. Biblical infallibility now abandoned, the idea that the source and certainty of the preacher's message are rooted in God's dictation and donation of truth is no longer tenable. The props that upheld him in the old Orthodox days are virtually all gone. The easy gift of authoritative truth has been denied him once for all. The study of a deposit of truth must give way to the search for reality. The case is quite the same in this regard if one turns from orthodoxy to rationalism, which undertook to replace the finished and final truth of revealed and authoritative biblical religion. According to rationalism, the human mind possesses a priori a sum of theoretical and practical ideas, untarnished by the corruptions and contingencies of experiential origin, from which absolute truth may be easily deduced. A religion of reason, consisting essentially of the ideas of God, of freedom, of the moral law, and of immortality, supplemented the religion of revelation at first, but subsequently became a forum before which the truth and error of all positive historical religions were adjudicated. The task of the old rationalistic clergyman who expounded the parsimonious content of truth inborn in his own reason, and skillfully demonstrated its agreement with Christianity, was simpler and shorter than the task of the orthodox clergyman burdened with the study of biblical languages, with exegesis and harmonizings with creeds and confessions. But the intellectual and critical movements of the modern world have remorselessly demolished this naive rationalism. As to those innate ideas, John Locke searched the infant mind and reported that he could not find any of them. He found that ideas are of temporal and empirical origin. Thus their fixed and eternal truths were undermined. Kant followed with his proof that the content of the religion of reason could not be object of rational knowledge, but only of faith. The outcome was that the authority of reason went the way of the authority of the Bible. All finished and fixed authorities fell, even that of conscience, since it too was unfinished and temporally and spatially conditioned. Of all this earlier mention will be recalled. In all these ways the task of the minister grew more difficult, more grievous. In the absence of easy donations of truth from an inerrant book, he must seek and try and doubt and test, with an open and candid truth-loving spirit. The study of theology becomes more important than ever. This importance consists not simply in the ascertainment of the truth, but especially in the formation of a religious personality. Through historical and philosophical study of the dissolution of orthodoxy and of rationalism, the student recapitulates and epitomizes the terrible experience of doubt, learns that religion is ever changing, ever in the making, and thus becomes personally prepared to meet the needs and difficulties of our age of doubt and transition and growth. It is not simply truth, but the truthful man, tried in the fires of critical theological research, that can win the confidence of our bewildered and discouraged religious life. Men who ask whether Christianity is final or transient, even whether religion is an illusion or a verity, cannot abide an answer from those ministers who have themselves never asked in anguish, and who cannot answer with sincerity out of the earnestness and courage of their own hearts. Reverting to the question of the influence of theological study upon the personal piety of the student, the possibilities are the dependence of piety upon theology, in which case theology could conceivably destroy or sustain piety, or the dependence of theology upon piety, faith, religion, with the reverse alternative to the former, or finally the complete or partial independence of the two. Representatives of each of these possibilities have been numerous in the history of the Church. In the end, theology annihilates faith. So the 2nd century Church maintained against Clement the Alexandrian theologian, and so Overbeck, for example, argues in recent years. Moreover, many a theological student feels as if the critical work in the classroom of a scientific theologian was a deadly assault upon his faith. Were this indeed true, there would be no help for it, since science cannot submit to quarantine from any region of reality that is accessible to examination, and since a faith that fears scrutiny is already enfeebled through self-distrust. For all the future, it would seem, the piety that resists research is foredoomed to atrophy. Indeed, part of the purpose of the study of theology is to subject our piety to the laws of survival. But while some divinity students make shipwreck of faith, a possible price to be paid to the right of science, the usual outcome is a destruction not of faith, but of the inherited form of faith. As a rule, the student closes his years of special study with his faith purged and strengthened, and adapted as never before to nourish and hearten him for the battle of life and the fullness of service. Ceasing to be a quantum of past beliefs, his faith becomes an interior attitude of his spirit, which science cannot take away. The opposite position, advocated strenuously in recent years by Bollinger, is quite out of harmony with the philosophic temper and thought of our new day. Its thesis is that theory precedes practice, that knowledge is the foundation of practical piety, that knowledge of God is the prius of faith in God, finally, that this knowledge is not traditional, in which case there would be no way to decide whether it was true or false, but demonstrative. It is clear that such a contention is a reversion to an obsolete rationalism with its theistic arguments and the like. Admitting, as a truth at which it hints, that there is an intellectual moment in the religious consciousness, still one of the great merits of scientific theology is its recognition that the way to God is not proof, but prayer, that we know God because we have faith in him, rather than have faith in him because we know him. Modern theology has probably done no more important service than to clarify this problem. There remains the possibility for which no less men than Kant and Schleiermacher stood, as have many Richelians, namely the reciprocal neutrality of theology and piety. Extreme as this position is, there is an important distinction between religion and theology, a distinction in form and function. Suffice it to say here that one of the purposes of the study of theology is to acquire a thorough understanding of this whole matter. Otherwise it would hardly be possible for the student to escape confusion and aberration. Failure to make such an escape would later yield the injurious result of misleading his church into a piety without knowledge, or a knowledge without piety, or an identification of the two, an evil to which the pages of church history bear impressive witness. The distinction, for instance, between the living real God and a concept God is vital to peace of mind and to the power of the gospel today. With reference to this whole question, it may be said that usually the candidate for the ministry, young though he may sometimes be, enters the divinity school as a finished religious and theological product, but that in consequence of his studies there he departs unfinished, growing aware that his personality, with its religion and its theology, are alike in the making. A divinity school that achieves such a result has fulfilled its function in the life of the human spirit. End of Chapter 12, Part 2. End of Guide to the Study of the Christian Religion, edited by Gerald Birney Smith.